Everyone. The House Senate Conference Committee on H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, will come to order. I'm deeply honored to chair this conference committee, the first tax reform conference committee in 31 years, and to be here with all of you as we move forward with this historic effort. Before I deliver my opening remarks, I want to take a moment to welcome everyone and to discuss the format of today's meeting. I'd also like to thank all the members of Congress joining us today from both sides of the Capitol and both sides of the aisle. I also thank all the members of the House and Senate and our professional staff who've worked so hard on tax reform over the past several years. In particular, the members of the Ways and Means Committee and Senator Hatch in the Finance Committee. We will begin today's meeting with the opportunity for each conferee to make an opening statement of up to 3 minutes. In order to respect everyone's time and ensure each conferee has the opportunity to speak today, I'll be enforcing this time limit. Once opening statements are complete, we will turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide a brief overview of the House and Senate versions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. After his presentation, conferees may question Mr. Barthold during that period, also in 3-minute increments. Finally, the chair will entertain unanimous consent requests to add statements and other materials into the record for this conference committee. With that, I now recognize myself for the purposes of delivering an opening statement. Today, we're coming together as a conference committee with one singular mission in mind: finalizing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and delivering transformational tax reform for the first time in 3 decades. We will consider the best ideas from the House and Senate passed legislation and will continue moving closer to one final pro-growth tax reform bill. Throughout our nearly 7-year journey on tax reform, we've had to make many choices with these goals in mind. For the first time in history, create a tax code built for growth and to leapfrog America back into the world lead. We rejected simply tweaking a few provisions of Washington's monstrous tax code and just calling it a day. Instead, we put it all on the table and went bold for the American people. To make America competitive again worldwide, we rejected simply aiming for average among our global competitors. Instead, we insisted on designing one of the most competitive tax systems in the world for the American people. We decided not only what we wanted our tax code to stand for, but who it would stand with, whether that was Washington's special interests or all the workers, families, and local job creators who truly bring life to our economy. We chose the American people. The bill before us now reflects all these decisions. More than that, it embodies the principles we've been committed to since the very beginning. This bill is a bold departure from the broken tax code America has today. It reduces tax rates for all Americans of all walks of life and delivers the lowest rates in modern history for businesses of all sizes. It provides a modern tax system that is tremendously competitive, one that will leapfrog America to the lead pack among our global competitors and unleash the growth of jobs and paychecks here at home. Above all, it makes clear that America's new tax code will be simple, fair, and focused on helping the American people, who, as President Reagan put it, are the only special interests that count. All of our work has brought us to this moment, and we have more important work ahead of us to finalize the bill. Let's not waver now. Let's not give in to the Washington status quo, not when tax reform is so close. This is our once-in-a-generation opportunity to deliver historic tax reform that we and the American people can all be proud of. And if we remain committed to the principles that have guided us from the very beginning, going bold, unleashing American competitiveness, and making our tax code simpler and fairer for all Americans, I'm confident we will. This time I recognize Senator Hatch for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to be here with everybody, and this is one of the truly important aspects of our country, that we can sit an open meeting in front of everybody and and talk about what we're going to do with regard to tax reform. I want to personally compliment Chairman Brady and the members of the House for the work that they've done on this. They've done a terrific job, both Democrats and Republicans, and I'm very proud of them. I also want to compliment our senators who have worked on the Finance Committee on these issues. We have good people there, and hopefully we can bring this thing to closure and do it in the best interests of our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's enough for me.
Thank you, Chairman Hatch. I recognize Representative Richie Neal of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to be recognized first on a point of personal privilege.
For what purpose?
I would like to move that the conference committee postpone its work and activity until the new senator from the state of Alabama is sworn in to office so that he might cast the vote based upon the precedent that was applied with the election of Scott Brown in Massachusetts in the Affordable Care Act.
I second the motion.
Thank you. So under the rules of the conference committee, that motion is not available, and we will continue.
Might I be allowed to question the ruling of the chair?
So, Mr. Neal, at this point, I'll recognize you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of last night's election, Mr. Chairman, I do not believe that we should be holding today's meeting. In fact, I think it's imperative that we respect the will of the people of Alabama and delay any further action on this tax bill until Senator-elect Jones can be seated. This situation is not unprecedented. As recently as 2010, during the debate on the ACA, my state of Massachusetts elected Scott Brown in a special election to succeed Ted Kennedy. Following the election, we heard strong words from Senator Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republican Party, in which he, quote, stated emphatically, "I think the message of the moment is that the American people all across the country are asking us, even in the most liberal state, Massachusetts, to stop this health care bill." What did Democrats do? We waited and respected the will of the people of Massachusetts. Quite simply, even when it was hard and against our own politics, Democrats did the right thing and allowed Senator Brown to cast a vote on final passage of the ACA. I hope we could do the same today. Turning to the tax bill, the Ryan McConnell tax package is a bad deal for the American people. This legislation raises taxes on millions of middle-class families, increases the national debt by more than $2.3 trillion, and eliminates deductions that help Americans afford to go to college, buy a home, and pay for medical expenses. From kids with disabilities to students pursuing a higher education to seniors with Alzheimer's, this bill punishes Americans at every stage of life. And as the New York Times reported this weekend, given the Republican shift as to how they will tax income, the tax code for the first time substantially will punish the wage earner while providing massive benefits to corporation shareholders and partners. Mr. Chairman, we can do better, and this is, if nothing else, a missed opportunity. Democrats will focus on tax reform that provides relief to all members of the middle class with a tax cut that, unlike the Republican bill in front of us today, would actually provide them with some relief. Our Republican friends also claim that their bill helps small businesses. That's not what I'm hearing for business owners back home in Springfield, Massachusetts, who have been excluded from much of this relief. Let me also take into account the unique circumstances for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. They have suffered terrible devastation and are still in the process of rebuilding and putting the pieces of their lives back together. The last thing they need is to get hit again. Finally, Republicans have shown their cards, and they're going to go after Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid next to justify this tax cut. They argue that we can no longer afford these programs after yanking $2.3 trillion from federal expenditure. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, before we see the final version of this bill, that we'll have a full discussion and debate on the potential that has been suggested in media accounts that the top rate is being moved from 39.6% to 37% to accommodate individuals in America who are now complaining about the elimination of the state and local tax deduction. With that, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Senator Wyden, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The American people are witnessing a masterclass in how one political party, relying on secrecy, distortion, and brute force, can muscle an unpopular, deficit-exploding corporate giveaway to passage. This is the ultimate betrayal of the middle class. It doesn't give middle-class Americans the tax cuts they deserve now, and it takes away Medicare and Social Security later. News just broke that Republicans have reached a final agreement. So let's understand what's happening today is a sham. This is an obvious attempt to lend credibility to a baseless Republican talking point about following regular order. Nobody ought to mistake this conference for real debate, not when Republicans and special interest lobbyists have already wrapped up the real talks in secret. They're going to be throwing parties on K Street while middle-class parents are struggling to determine if their families are going to be among the millions of losers. From the top, Republicans have had an undivided focus on delivering the sweetest possible deal for the multinational corporations and the powerful. Permanent corporate breaks, huge new loopholes, a tax hike on 13 million middle-class taxpayers in the first year and millions more after that, and big new incentives for corporations to ship jobs overseas while tens of millions of Americans either go without health care or see their premiums jump. The details still leak out, but at every turn in the debate, more bad news for the middle class. A final bill will come with an astonishing price tag, and it's bound to do a terrible job getting help to those who need it. It's clear now that Republicans decided to pass on a final opportunity to take a different tack, to protect the middle class from harm. They reportedly settled on even bigger breaks for those at the top, a capstone on a budget-busting gift to corporations of the donor class. At first, the deficit hawks were quiet at the prospect of an unpaid-for tax bill piling onto the national debt, but they are screeching again, seizing on the deficits as a pretext to slash Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, anti-hunger programs, and more. Colleagues, I close by saying it did not have to be this way. The tax code is broken. Democrats agree. 17 moderate Democrats asked again for a bipartisan bill. I've written, as the chairman knows, 2 full bipartisan tax reform bills. It did not have to be this way, and it is not too late for bold members on either side to reject this reckless partisan process, work on a bipartisan basis as Ronald Reagan did, and put the interests of the middle class first. I yield the balance of my time as chairman. As we discussed, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that Senator Murray's statement be entered into the record at this point.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I have a motion in writing pertaining to the format of today's meeting at the desk, and I would urge its consideration.
So thank you. Under the conference committee rules, the motion is not available. We will continue.
Is it your ruling that you will not permit the motion to
may.
be presented?
If I may, Representative.
Then I would respectfully appeal
Thank
the
you,
ruling
Mr.
of the
Chairman.
chair. I understand your desire
Chairman
to
Brady.
muzzle this conference, but I would urge my
Thank
motion.
you, Mr. Doggett, if
Mis-
you would.
Mr. Chairman, in that case, I would offer another
Chairman, I
motion that is
believe
at
that
the
I-
desk, that is a privileged motion under both the Senate and the House rules, and would urge its consideration at this time, and it is consistent with the rules of the House and Senate and of this conference.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. We will return to regular order. Mr.
Regular order is to consider privileged motions when they're offered, even if you don't want to consider them, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
We're
Doggett,
operating under
so let
House
me-
and Senate and conference rules, not Putin rules.
So it has been a long time since we've had a conference committee. Let's remind each other of the rules. There are few rules that govern how we conduct meetings of the conference committee, other than that we have at least one public meeting, which we are doing today. As I advised in advance, the purpose of this meeting is to allow our members on both sides of the aisle to make statements and ask technical questions of Mr. Bartold of the Joint Committee on Taxation. With
Mr.
that,
Chairman, I have
we
a
will
highly
continue.
privileged motion under the rules of the House and Senate that are applicable to this conference, calling for an adjournment under certain conditions,
Thank
and
you,
I
Mr.
urge that
Doggett.
motion.
So that motion is not available?
Motion is
And-
available.
And you will not interrupt again until we've let Mr. Nunes continue this hearing.
Well, I will interrupt
Thank you,
until
Mr.
you
Chairman.
honor the
I-
motion and follow the rules, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you.
It is regular order.
Thank you. Mr. Nunes, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brady, Chairman Hatch, and fellow members of this historic conference committee. Thank you for your leadership and continued dedication to reforming our nation's broken tax code. We are on the brink of fundamentally transforming our tax system, and I want to take this opportunity to reiterate what I believe should be included in the final bill. Special interests in Washington are constantly adding new provisions to the tax code, making it increasingly complex and rife with loopholes. As a result, the current tax code distorts business decisions and makes it nearly impossible for small businesses to compete on a level playing field. The final bill reported out of this committee must strive to wipe the tax code clean and replace it with simpler and more transparent rules. In addition to policies promoting simplification, several key measures aimed at unleashing small business growth should be included in the final package. One of those is full and immediate expensing for equipment, both new and used, which I have advocated for many years. This would provide a strong incentive for business investment that would create jobs, boost wages, and spark economic growth. Another strong investment incentive I support, which was included in the version of H.R. 1, House version H.R. 1, is extending the lower pass-through rate of 25% to passive business income. This would provide huge incentives for entrepreneurship and overall business investment for startups and small businesses. The provisions I've mentioned will create economic growth, a goal for which my Republican and Democrat colleagues have pledged their support. At the end of the day, we must simply ask ourselves whether we want to stick with today's complex, punitive, and unfair tax code, or take the courageous step necessary to unshackle our economy to the benefit of all Americans. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I would have a question, if I might. If there is an agreement from the at this point on the Republican side regarding the conference committee, will we have an opportunity to see that? I know at some point we will be asking Mr. Bartold questions, but other than what I'm hearing from the lobbyists downtown who are now circulating what's in the bill, I'd like to know whether or not they're accurate or not. I'm assuming they are, but
So, Senator, if I may,
what's the process
we will,
for us getting
under
written?
the rules of the conference committee, when the committee report is filed, the public and members will have full opportunity to examine that conference committee report, and then under the regular process, to have a vote in the House and the Senate.
And when are you anticipating that being filed?
And so the timetable will be driven by completion of the conference committee report. Yes, with that.
So will it be before we are asking questions of staff so we know what we're asking about at this point?
So
I mean,
we'll-
it's very difficult. I appreciate that we're here, but
So it's a great question.
how
So,
do we-
Senator,
how do we
I
ask questions?
anticipate the conference committee will file its report at the end of this week.
end of the week, but
Yes, ma'am.
today we're asking questions. So could you give us a hint on what we're asking
Yes.
questions about?
I'd be glad to. So the Senate passed a tax reform bill, as
I'm
the
aware.
House did as well. So we'll be questioning Mr. Bartold on the two bills which we are reconciling the differences of.
Okay, we just don't know what you've agreed to
Senator
at this point.
Enzi.
Thank you.
Chairman Enzi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brady, for convening this important meeting. This is an important day as we take another step closer towards enacting historic tax reform that'll help boost America's economy, that'll make the system simpler and fairer, and it'll put more money in people's pockets. This will also help grow the economy, create more jobs, and it will raise wages for hardworking families. The time for reforming our tax code is long overdue, and our economy, businesses, and American families are paying the price. Since we last transformed our tax code roughly 30 years ago, globalization, the emergence of new technologies, changes in the labor force have transformed the way our economy operates. It's past time for us to act to modernize our tax code so that our nation can remain competitive in a 21st century economy. Our current code is an outdated mess that's hurting American workers and holding our economy back. That's why we need tax reform that will ensure the competitive footing of our businesses and make our system simpler and fairer and allow people to keep more of what they earn. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will do that. It'll provide tax relief for hardworking Americans and make changes to our tax code that businesses large and small need to help grow the economy and create jobs. If you care about jobs, if you care about American companies staying here and being able to compete globally, then you should care about reforming our business tax system. America has the fourth highest corporate tax rate in the world. We need to encourage companies to remain in the United States and bring back their overseas money to increase the number of jobs here in the United States. Lowering our uncommonly high, uncompetitive business tax rate would be one of the quickest ways to solve that problem. It's time to make America a more inviting place to invest, to do business, and create jobs. This bill will also provide relief to small family-owned businesses Small businesses are the nation's economic engine and currently employ the majority of the private sector, particularly in Wyoming. These small businesses are part of the backbone of our communities, and we want to have the opportunity to grow and provide more jobs. I join my colleagues today not only as the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee and a member of the Finance Committee, but also as an accountant and former small business owner. I believe this bill will make critical and long-due changes to our tax code that will jumpstart our economy. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Levin, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The headline here says Republicans say they have a deal on tax bill, and we're having a conference committee on two bills that passed the two houses. This is indeed a mockery. The horse is out of the barn, but it's limping, and it's limping badly. Of all the fake claims we've heard over the last few months, the greatest is that the Republican tax bills are focused on helping the middle class. And it's interesting, in your language, you kind of drop that. Why? Because the truth is that millions of middle-income Americans would be forced to pay higher taxes under these bills. In 2019, nearly 13 million Americans with incomes below $200,000 a year would pay higher taxes under both the House and Senate bills. By 2027, over 32 million would pay higher taxes under the House bill, and nearly 38 million under the Senate bill. Tell us what it is in your bill if you'll take it from out under the table. These higher taxes come from Republican proposals to limit the state and local tax deduction and other provisions. The Republican claim that their bills are aimed at helping the middle class truly deserves 4 Pinocchios. It's so bad, I hope those that check the facts will add a 5th Pinocchio to this bill. The second outrage is the myth that tax cuts for the top pay for themselves, and that the $2.3 trillion in new debt that would be amassed under the GOP tax changes will be erased by economic growth. In reality, the middle class will get stuck with the bill for this debt, either through a future deficit tax or through cuts to programs they depend on, such as Medicare. Meanwhile, those earning over $1 million a year will get an average tax cut of over $73,000 in 2019 under Republican proposals, at least those that we've seen, and it may even be worse as you're lowering the rate on the upper income. This is truly class warfare, Republican warfare against the middle class and all who aspire. You are working in desperation, not in deliberation. You will create new tax holes that will plague us for years, and slapdash proposals supposedly designed to reduce the offshoring of American companies and jobs may actually make the problem worse. I was going to write, we need to hit the pause button before it's too late. You've made it too late, a mockery out of this process.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Senator Sanders, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as I think you well know and everybody at this table understands, this conference, so-called conference committee, is a farce. According to media reports, the final legislation has already been completed. This legislation, which will have a major impact on our economy, has not had one public hearing. Not hearing from economists, from governors, from mayors, from the business community, from ordinary Americans as to what the impact of this legislation will be. This is legislation written for wealthy campaign contributors, and I want to congratulate some of my Republican colleagues for being honest about that. What they said publicly is that they don't pass this bill, their wealthy friends will stop contributing. I appreciate that honesty. This legislation, in fact, not only had no public hearings, but it did have some 6,000 Washington, D.C. lobbyists working on it behind closed doors. Mr. Chairman, every poll that I have seen shows that by overwhelming numbers, the American people do not want this bill to be passed. They know that in the Senate bill, in the midst of massive income and wealth inequality, 62% of the benefits go to the top 1%, and 42% of the benefits go to the top 1/10 of 1%. In America today, the very wealthy are becoming much more wealthy, while the middle class continues to shrink. And your solution is to give 62% of the benefits to the top 1%. The American people also understand that at the end of 10 years, 83 million middle-class families will see their taxes go up under the Senate bill. They know that with 13 million Americans losing their health insurance, health care premiums on the individual market will increase by 10%. And they know that despite the Republicans telling us how concerned you are about the deficit is going to go up by $1.4 trillion over the next 10 years. And what the American people also are deeply concerned about is what House Speaker Ryan is talking about. And what he is talking about is that after you raise the deficit by $1.4 trillion by giving huge tax breaks to the wealthy and large corporations, you're going to come back and you're going to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and education, and the needs of working families. What kind of decency is there when we have legislation that gives massive tax breaks to billionaires and then comes back in months to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid? This bill must not be passed.
Mr. Roskam, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 50 years from now, economic historians and social scientists are going to look back at this moment. And what we're actually talking about right now is bigger than tax reform. Because if you peel this discussion back, what you will see is two views of the economy that are competing for the affections of the American people. Just two entirely different worldviews. And in my opinion, one of them is a cul-de-sac. It is basically the economics of envy, and that was the description in a nutshell of Senator Sanders a minute ago. By contrast, there is the economics of invitation and opportunity. And in my opinion, that is really what this debate is all about. And that's why it is so hopeful. And look, the American public has been told in the previous administration, you're stuck in your station in life. And the only way you can get out of your station in life is if some federal program comes over the hill and pulls you out. And I'm not against federal programs per se, but you take my point. That is, we need a generation of millennials who are coming to fruition and coming to maturity in an economy that is growing and vibrant and dynamic. I think what is so interesting is the American people, in my opinion, are longing to be kindled and to be coaxed and cajoled out of the cul-de-sac of envy and onto a highway of opportunity. And when it all comes down to it, the proof is that is who the American people are. We have historically not been a jealous people. How do I know that? Because when people are successful around us, what do we say? How nice for you. And here's why we say that. We think that could be me, that could be my kids, that could be my grandchildren. And we know time and time and time again the stories of people who have gone from incredibly modest backgrounds, some of whom are sitting at these tables, to incredible success within a lifetime and so forth. So tax reform matters. It is at the foundation. It is at the foundation of this. But we are talking about a trajectory that is going to impact our nation like no other vote that Congress is going to take. And in closing, let me make this point. We all long for America to be a strong diplomatic power. In order to do that, America needs to be a strong military power. And in order to do that, America needs to be a strong economic power. So we can do incredible things if we focus in and recognize where we are and where we need to go. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to admit for the record an editorial from the Chicago Tribune from December 5th entitled, "This Tax Deal Will Make America More Prosperous." I yield back.
Without objection. Senator Murkowski, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This effort before us is tax reform. I believe will be good for our economy, good for jobs and growth, good for American families and businesses. And I'm proud to be able to support this effort to reform our tax policies. I'm also proud to be the lead author of our energy title, which contains the single most important step that I believe we can take to strengthen our long-term energy security and create new wealth. Create new wealth. We fought long to authorize a program for responsible energy development in Alaska's non-wilderness 1002 area, which Congress specifically set aside for its evaluation of its oil and gas potential. Within our Title II, we've strengthened this within committee by adopting a bipartisan amendment from Senators Cassidy, Strange, and Kirk that will increase revenue sharing for the Gulf Coast for priorities like coastal restoration and hurricane protection. We raise within our title more than $1 billion over the next 10 years, and once production begins, it will likely raise over $100 billion for the federal treasury. And again, this is new wealth from responsible development and the investment that it brings. We create thousands of jobs in Alaska and across the country. We help to keep energy affordable, effectively providing families and businesses with an energy tax cut. We will protect our national security by reducing foreign oil dependence, helping our West Coast states, particularly states like Washington and California, that their refineries receive the jobs here. And, Mr. Chairman, none of this comes at the expense of our environment or sacrificing our local voices. Alaskans know how to produce energy while protecting the environment, and thanks to new technologies, the footprint of development is even smaller than ever. Our language is fully protective. We do not waive any environmental review process or consultation requirements with Alaska Native peoples in any way. All we limit is surface development to 2,000 federal acres. That's just 1/10,000th of all of ANWR. So, Mr. Chairman, it's time to open up the 1002 area, and it's time to reform our broken tax code. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dogg, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would respectfully move that the conference committee stand adjourned with its work unfinished until the Secretary of the Treasury, Stephen Mnuchin, together with the Director of the Office of Tax Analysis, can be present for questioning, but no later than 2 p.m. Monday, December the 18th.
I second the motion.
Second the motion.
Thank you. That motion is not available. We will reserve.
Mr. Chairman, I appeal the ruling of the chair.
So that motion is also not available.
All right,
So let me
Mr.
go
Chairman,
back over the committee rules.
Well,
So,
what are the
format
committee rules
today.
other than we do whatever you want?
So the reminder
Is there
again-
any other rule?
So Mr. Doggett,
Please
reminder
don't take
again-
this reminder out of my time.
So, Mr. Doggett's reminder is that there are few rules that govern this committee, other than that we have at least one public meeting. We hear out our views upon these two different tax reform vehicles and express our desire of what we need to do to move forward on tax reform. So I recognize you for an opening statement.
For how much time?
So 3 minutes, yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I understand your fear of having anyone record a vote in the process of this entire conference committee. I would just remind you, this is the United States Congress, not the Duma. This is a privileged motion under the rules of both the House and the Senate, and it ought to be considered. You know, there is considerable harm done by this bill, driving up the national debt to an incredible level that will allow you to use that as an excuse to undermine Medicare and educational opportunity and the entire social services net to protect people across this country, not to mention the effect on law enforcement and our national infrastructure. There is the great harm that you do in favoring those at the top at the expense of students, of those that are sick, of others that lose their deduction under this bill. That widening of the income gap is a great wrong. There is great wrong in the fact that you decide to create giant new loopholes in all these secret meetings you've been having, giant new loopholes that will lead to the outsourcing of more American jobs abroad that create an incentive for multinationals to move jobs abroad. But you know, all of these wrongs, and the wrongs that I've heard my fellow colleagues talk about today and that I know others will speak about, they are not the greatest wrong that is occurring here. What we are seeing today with this authoritarian rule, with the kind of approach that is much closer to to all those third world authoritarian figures that Donald Trump likes to be so close to. What we are seeing is a steady erosion of democracy here in the People's House and in this Congress. Republicans have decided it's a little bit easier to force through legislation if you don't conduct a public hearing on that legislation. And so when it came to taking away health care from millions of Americans, they chose not to have a hearing on the bill. And they've decided that it's a little easier, particularly with the Trump administration, if you never have any official from the administration with the courage to come and answer questions about the total hypocrisy between what the president tweets and what they're doing in this House, in this Congress. They have decided that it is a little easier to approve legislation if you don't allow members of the business community and academia and just ordinary citizens to come here and comment on this. And today, in the height of absurdity, minutes after they have announced that they have an agreed bill, we don't have that bill here. We're told to make speeches and ask questions to joint tax about a bill they have but they're not disclosing. We're to ask questions about a bill that was but it may not be currently the bill. What we do know is that this entire process is a great
Thank
lie
you.
wrapped in a lie.
Thank you,
It's a sneak
Mr. Doggett.
attack on America.
All
I
time has
yield back.
expired. So, Representative Black, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It really is a pleasure to be here with my colleagues from both chambers for this very important discussion on H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Our conversation today in this conference committee meeting represents an important moment for the American people. It's yet another essential step in the right direction. And it's a moment that reminds us to think back of how far we've come and how close we are to delivering a much-needed tax relief for hardworking, middle-income Americans. Without question, tax reform has long been a priority for Republicans in Congress. During my 7 years here in the House, serving on the Ways and Means Committee, we have studied, we've considered, and we've outlined the sorts of reform that could provide real benefits for the American people. Following last year's election, we knew that this is our year to finally make tax reform a reality. We've been preparing for a long time for this day, and I'm grateful for the President's support of our work on every step of the way. Earlier this fall, I was especially pleased when both chambers agreed to the same budget, which marked a major step forward with our shared priority for a once-in-a-generation tax reform. Yes, we are still working out our differences between the House and the Senate tax bills, but I am encouraged that we've always agreed on the same principles. First and foremost, we all recognize the need to do something about a heavy tax burden weighing down hardworking Americans and holding back job creators. We also recognize that the tax code is too complicated and must be simplified. Through tax reform, we can help low and middle income Americans see more of their hard-earned paychecks, and we can empower entrepreneurs and small businesses to continue opening, operating, and expanding on Main Street. We can make it easier for everyone to navigate the needlessly burdensome tax system. And while the numbers understandably vary between the House and the Senate passed versions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, both promise the economic jolt that our country needs badly. For example, an average middle-income family of four, the House-passed bill would mean a tax cut of nearly $1,200. And in my home state of Tennessee, the House-passed bill would create more than 18,000 new jobs and allow families to see nearly $2,000 increase in their wages. And I mention this to remind everyone that we are talking about real money for real people. And despite what the critics may say, this is not just a tax cut for the wealthy. It's not a tax increase on the poor, and it's not an attack on middle class. The truth is that our conservative tax reform delivers tax relief at every income level, and it protects more hard-earned dollars from taxes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Senator Corner, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Brady. I'd like to thank you and all of our House colleagues for your tremendous work and partnership in this effort, bringing us to this point. I also want to thank my leader, Chairman Hatch of the Finance Committee, who has done a tremendous job, and all of my colleagues on the Senate Finance Committee for their tremendous work. I also want to acknowledge the Chairman Enzi's work. This all started with a budget resolution, which gave us the ability to move forward as we have and bring us to this point. So many people have said that tax reform couldn't be done. It's too hard, and that's the reason it hadn't been done since 1986. No one will agree on how to simplify it, they said. Nobody knows how to make it fair. Nobody knows how to ease the tax burden on working Americans and the middle class. But today I'm glad to say that those naysayers were wrong. Not only have we passed comprehensive tax reform in both of our respective chambers, we've also done it in a way that will help all Americans. We've lowered rates, the child tax credit has been doubled, and the standard deduction has been doubled as well. Companies are incentivized to invest and relocate in the United States rather than to take their operations and investments and jobs overseas. Truthfully, some of this we've done by adopting some of the ideas of some of our colleagues across the aisle over the years. I know the senator from Oregon, the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, had a great piece of legislation. It was called the Coates-Wyden Plan, which argued for a corporate tax reduction, recognizing that America had the highest corporate tax rate in the world, and that chased jobs and investment overseas. We've adopted that concept along with other concepts and included this in the bill to make America's tax code much more competitive. I would say that it's interesting listening to our friends across the aisle who seem to make four arguments. They said, we haven't seen the bill, and then they proceed to criticize what they think is in the bill. Then they complain about this process, saying they haven't been able to participate when they have voluntarily chosen not to participate in the process. But I'm proud of what we've been able to do to simplify the code, to reduce rates, and to make America more competitive. We simply don't have to settle for the same old status quo that we've seen over the last few years with anemic economic growth and insufficient job creation. I believe with Mr. Roskam, as he said, this is a tax reform plan that is optimistic and will provide great opportunities, increases in wages, more take-home pay, and more jobs and investment created right here in America. We reject this idea that America cannot do any better than the status quo, which seems to be the attitude of our colleagues across the aisle.
Point of personal privilege,
Thank you.
Chairman, for 30 seconds.
So, Senator, we'll have an opportunity either for a second round or one of your colleagues to yield to you. I will recognize Representative Noem. My guess is she's not yielding to you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership throughout this process. You've let us be legislators. And I think that has given us the good options that we have before us today, and I really appreciate that. I come to this table today as a farmer and as a rancher, a small business owner, but most importantly, as a mom. I came here to make sure that our tax code reflects the priorities that we have in this country, and I came to fight for those in South Dakota who haven't been heard before. You know, the average household income in my home state of South Dakota is $54,000 per year. And in South Dakota, our folks pay double the national average in energy costs. That means they have very little extra money to spend on their families, do something for fun, or keep in a savings account. We need to build a healthier economy that creates jobs that pays them higher wages, let them hang on to more of their dollars each and every day. And so that's why in this bill, I fought not only to significantly lower tax rates, but also to dramatically expand the child tax credit, to keep the child care tax credit, to make sure that we had flexible spending benefits, and also that we maintain incentives in our tax code for saving for retirement, for education, making sure that we have money to build a new home. Those are tools that families can use to give their kids a good start. And when those same kids grow up, I'm fighting to make sure that they can find good, high-paying jobs in America. We have to make sure that our farmers and our ranchers and our small businesses can thrive under this new tax code. In the House bill, we fully and permanently repealed the death tax. And I want to thank the chairman for that, for getting rid of that un-American, unfair tax. We give people better expensing tools, and in the House bill, we drive down the rate for small businesses and keep an interest deductibility option for those as well. I understand that no tax form plan is going to be perfect in everyone's eyes. We had 12 formal hearings on taxes in the Ways and Means Committee and discussed all the different options and proposals that everybody had. But what I want to remind each and every conferee that's here today is that we weren't called here just to make a few tweaks around the edges, to make a few changes. We were called here today to make sure that our tax code is fixed forever. We do this once every 30 years, so let's not tweak it and just change it. Let's fix it for the long term. The American people deserve more control over their paychecks. They've worked hard for that money. They've taken time away from their families to earn that money. They ought to be the ones deciding how, where, and when to spend it. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Garayalva. You're recognized for an
Thank you,
opening
Mr.
statement.
Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's very difficult as we go through this process, the denial of motions. You, sir, keep referring to the rules of the conference. I think I'm missing something. When did we adopt those rules? What are they? When were they decided upon? It's difficult not to feel like a prop here. This has been predestined and decided already. For example, the Senate chose to use the tax bill to try to open up the Arctic National Wild Refuge to oil drilling, a completely unrelated, unpopular provision that should be forced to this Congress under these procedures. They should be taken out, and the issue is that the Native people in the area, it's not just their opposition. It is the fact that this is not necessary. It's wildly optimistic that because of these, what's going to happen in the Arctic Refuge, that somehow that is going to offset part of the huge deficit that's being created by this legislation. We don't need the oil. We're exporting millions of barrels a day from this country, and I would hope that there's consideration given to that. But there's other things as well. An important issue is Puerto Rico. The House chose to put a 20% excise tax on products manufactured in Puerto Rico by U.S. companies. That further devastates that island, whose recovery has been shortchanged by federal agencies in terms of responding to their needs. While I have many concerns about the tax bills, including my Republican colleagues' blatant attempt to make college even more unaffordable, the Senate's attempt to cut off health care for 13 million Americans. Well, let me just end with this. I hope that my colleagues will hear what the will of the American people. They don't want a tax giveaway to billionaires and corporations at the expense of the middle class, plain and simple. They don't want working families to have to carry the burden of this and to risk Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid in the future as a justification and a self-fulfilling prophecy that's generated by this tax bill. This is not the politics of envy that I'm talking about. These are the politics of fairness. And this bill is not fair to the vast, vast majority of the American people. It is because it's a vehicle to get things done that normally would not pass through the regular process in Congress. And the secretness of it and the fact that some of us feel like props here as part of this, something that's already been decided, I think the American people feel the same way. And with that, I yield back.
Senator Cantwell, you're recognized for an opening statement.
The House and Senate bills severely undermine the means by which we build affordable housing for working-class families in America. The low-income housing tax credit was enacted as part of the 1986 Act and had bipartisan support. Senator Hatch and I believe that we should be expanding the affordable tax credit. 9 members of the Finance Committee, including 5 Republican members, are co-sponsors of the bill. In fact, 4 Republican co-sponsors of the affordable housing tax credit expansion are sitting on this conference committee, as well as 3 Democratic co-sponsors. Yet the tax bill before us today goes in the opposite direction, with potentially crippling impact on our nation's most important program for building and preserving affordable housing. Nearly 20 million Americans are in this crisis of affordability. Look at what's happening now in the states of Texas and Florida as they face the crisis of rebuilding after the hurricanes. Under the House proposal, the tax-exempt status for private activity bonds would be eliminated, including for multi-housing bonds, which would account for about half of all the housing production under the low-income housing tax credit. I keep hearing justifications for getting rid of the bonds because some people don't like the activities that they support, but tell me which ones that you don't support that for housing. If it is the case, preserve the housing credit. According to an estimate, as many as 800,000 fewer units will be built over the next 10 years because of this House language. Now, the Senate has problems as well, and obviously we want to make sure that our colleagues understand that investors who currently are able to deduct losses generated in the investment as a result of the limit on the rents to make sure that housing is affordable. Affordable housing projects do not earn returns for their investors like private real estate. So reducing the top rate does not provide a benefit and will not increase an incentive. It is because the tax deduction investors take under the proposal will be worth considerably less at 20% compared to the 35% rate. The result is investors will pay less for the given credit, and we estimate as about $2 billion less, 200,000 units, about a 15% reduction. As well as the beat erosion, trying to focus on foreign corporations, we believe that there are those who are investing along with J.P. Morgan Chase and Citigroup that account for about $1.5 to $2 billion of investment annually that also will be reduced, making about 10 to 15% less available for investment in affordable housing. These three things taken together will probably, if all impacted the way this bill is written, reduce by 50% the amount of affordable housing when we need to be going in the rest of the direction. I yield to my colleague.
I thank my colleague. I'm going to be very brief. The senator from Texas just said the Republican bill is following the lead of the only bipartisan tax reform bill. That statement
gentlelady's time
could
has
not
expired.
be further from the truth.
Thank you.
He is talking about the Republican bill,
Senator
territorial
Cantwell's
taxation,
time has expired.
rather than keeping
Senator
jobs here
Cantwell's
in this country.
time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
So, that motion is not available in the conference.
Not even a
committee.
motion, it's a question as to procedure, Mr. Chairman.
so,
Questions of procedure are
We
not,
will,
are not
so
available.
the format of the conference committee is one round of statements, opening statements, followed by a second round of questioning of Mr. Bartold about the two bills that are being considered for.
I appreciate that, but when can questions as to procedure as to how the conference will continue? For example, will this conference be able to reconvene and have questions of whatever is the final bill of Mr. Bartold? Will we get a score of the Joint Tax Committee and CBO before a final vote? Will there be an opportunity for motions and amendments to be offered? Will we convene again? I mean, I think that those are legitimate questions, certainly in the greatest deliberative body in the world. This is
Thank
not
you,
Cuba.
Senator. So
This
the
is the
rules
United
of the,
States of America.
Thank you, Senator. So the rules of the conference committee are that when the conference committee is reported, members as well as the public will have an opportunity to examine it, review it, and deliberate on it before it goes to the House and Senate for a vote.
Will it have a CBO, a JCT score? Will we be able to ask questions?
You'll have an opportunity to question Mr. Bartold ahead of
On a bill
Committee on
that doesn't exist. We're getting criticized for making comments about bills that don't exist. We don't know what the bill is. We know what the Senate passed, we know what the House passed, but we don't know what this bill is.
Thank you.
So what am I might as well ask about questions on March.
Thank you, Senator. So, Mr. Bishop, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I'm confused. Do I have to be demagogic, or can I just talk?
Probably can do both.
Okay, I'll try that. I realize, first of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you, maybe Chairman Roskam, for letting me bend your ears on a whole range of questions on this entire bill. But I would like to focus on maybe Title II of this particular provision. And for Ron, if you'd like to tell him, it's probably not as good as the Wyden-Bishop bill, but it's darn close to it. So thank you for that. Look, this bill, or Title II of this bill, actually fulfills the Budget Committee's instructions to us to provide revenue as well as to provide energy security and independence at the same time. So the 1002 area that was established, when it was established, the special purpose of that is consistent with what we are doing in Title II. This has the support of the entire Alaska delegation. Okay, not many of them, but they are united in the delegation. Has supported the Alaska people, also the natives who live in that area of Alaska. They realize, as we all do, that this area, especially Title II, will provide well-paying jobs for the middle-class families, as well as producing a source of energy for the rest of us. And let's face it, we're talking about 2,000 acres in a 19 million acre reserve. That's what the 1002 area is. And so I'm very proud of the Title II in this. It does continue. It will promote a pro-job, pro-environment, pro-growth, pro-American energy legislation. It will produce increases in energy. At the same time, it will help cut taxes for average middle-income American families. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're going forward with. And I'm very proud of that particular section, and I appreciate all those who've worked so hard on that. I owe you back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Senator Thune, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Senators Hatch, Enzi, Murkowski on our side and their counterparts on the House side, or on the Senate side, on the House side, for getting us where we are today. And let me just say, with respect to my colleagues in the Senate who have protested the process, as well as those in the House, that in the Senate, I got on the Finance Committee in 2011. I got on that committee because, like everybody else, if you're in the Senate, you're in the House, you want to be on Finance or Ways and Means, because that's where you do big stuff like tax reform. So I came on in 2011. Since 2011, we have had no fewer than 70 hearings on tax reform. And in 2015, under Chairman Hatch's leadership, we had 5 working groups that studied various aspects of the tax code. They were bipartisan working groups. And the product of the working group that I led, along with Senator Cardin, resulted in this. These are recommendations for tax reform. A lot of these are Democrat ideas, they're Republican ideas, much of which is included in this bill. The substance of this bill is very bipartisan, even though our colleagues like to think that the process was not. When we marked it up in the Senate Finance Committee, we spent 23 hours doing it over several days. I know that the House Ways and Means Committee had a multi-day markup as well. There were 63 Democrat amendments that were voted on during the markup in the Senate Finance Committee. So anybody that suggests this has not been a normal, regular order process is just missing the facts. And the other fact I want to point out, because it's been mentioned a lot today, is that who's going to benefit from this? We came at this with a couple of objectives, one of which was to deliver meaningful tax relief to middle-income families. And, you can argue about distribution tables, which I think the distribution tables reflect that. But there are some basic objective facts that are just undeniable. One of which is that this proposal doubles the standard deduction. Another which is it doubles the child tax credit. Another is that it lowers rates. And so if you look at what that impact is on a typical family in South Dakota, my colleague from South Dakota talked about the average income, but let's take a family of 4 with a combined annual income of $73,000 a year. Under the Senate bill, and I think the House bill, as we merge them together, will be very similar, that family would get a $2,200 tax cut, which represents a 60% reduction over what they're paying under current law. Now, one of my colleagues over here, former colleagues on the House side, mentioned something about Pinocchios earlier on. And there was actually a number of our Democrat colleagues in the Senate who got up earlier this year and were attacking the Senate bill. And this is what the Washington Post fact checker said about their comments. In their haste to condemn the GOP tax plan, Democrats have spread far and wide the false claim that families making less than $86,100 on average will face a hefty tax hike. Actually, it's the opposite.
The gentleman's time has expired.
The Washington Post gave that statement for Pinocchios.
The gentleman's time has expired. Representative Cash, you're recognized for an
Thank you,
opening
Mr.
statement.
Chairman. Just a quick question before I begin my statement. Would it be more constructive for the committee to review the reports, the press reports of the final details on Twitter that are all spilling out now from various sources in K Street, rather than...
Yeah, the gentlelady is recognized for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, members, here we are 2 weeks before Christmas, and the Republican tax bill is one that Ebenezer Scrooge would love. It is a big bah humbug for the families and communities that we represent back home. It raises taxes on millions of middle-class families while showering big corporations and the super rich with huge tax cuts and new loopholes. It is unfair, and it will squeeze middle-class families. And it does this by adding over $2.3 trillion to the national debt, crowding out our ability to invest in modern infrastructure, in medical research, in education, our national security, and more. And any crumbs thrown to working families and retirees are likely to be eaten up by the GOP plan to ask those who rely on Medicare and Medicaid to pay more. So just like Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, I'm sure my Republican colleagues are being haunted by the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future. Now, the ghost of Christmas past reminded Scrooge that he had lost the love of his life because he loved money more. He loved money more than anything else. And that's what the Republicans propose, to reward privilege rather than hard work. Greed doesn't make America great. What makes America great is opportunity and sweat and hard work. Republicans yank up the ladders of opportunity for teachers, for graduate students, and families with student loans. Recall the ghost of Christmas present. He informed Scrooge that Tiny Tim would die soon unless Scrooge changed his ways. Well, Republicans take aim at Tiny Tim and millions of other families all across America by eliminating health coverage and raising health care costs on millions more. Americans with pre-existing conditions will be priced out of the market because you are destroying the Affordable Care Act health care pool. Over 1.7 million Floridians right now depend on the Affordable Care Act for their health coverage. And if that isn't enough, Republicans are poised to end the medical expense deduction and thereby impose a new health tax on families with a child with special needs, with families that have a member with Alzheimer's or cancer, or a spouse in a skilled nursing center. And you should also fear the ghost of Christmas yet to come because Republicans add $2.3 trillion to the national debt. This is fiscally irresponsible. It's a ticking time bomb. But Speaker Ryan says no worries. Our ability to,
Ladies, time
we're going to look
expired.
to Medicare and Medicaid
Thank
to make
you.
up the difference.
The
It's
gentleman's
unfair
time
and
has
it's a
expired.
big bah humbug.
Senator Stabenow, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We need tax reform that creates jobs, that closes tax loopholes and brings jobs home, protects our farmers, helps our small businesses, puts more money in the pockets of middle-class families in Michigan and across the country. If that was the legislation in front of us, or whatever is going to be in front of us, whatever version that we see, I'd be happy to support it. However, that is not what this legislation does. Instead, it provides huge tax giveaways to the wealthiest 1% and promises Michigan families the same old trickle-down economics. This is not new. Same old trickle-down economics that somehow never trickles down to them in their paychecks or in their pockets. Under the Senate bill, parents making $500,000 a year will enjoy a new $4,000 child tax credit for their 2 children. Meanwhile, the working class parents of 10 million children will receive nothing under the House proposal, $75 or less under the Senate proposal. We don't know about the final here. That's not even enough to buy a week's worth of groceries. And millions of middle-class Americans will actually get a tax increase. Happy holidays. Here's your tax bill. Now, a few of my friends across the aisle have told the truth about this legislation. One of our House Republican colleagues from South Carolina said, quote, fundamentally, the bill has been mislabeled. From a truth in advertising standpoint, it's fundamentally a corporate tax reduction and restructuring bill, period. He said, I think they were particularly concerned about innuendo and what that might mean. So it was labeled a middle-class tax cut. Well, labeling something a middle-class tax cut doesn't mean it's a middle-class tax cut. Families in Michigan deserve better, they deserve tax relief, and they deserve to be told the truth. And here's the truth. Since 1979, wages for the top 1% have grown by 138%. Meanwhile, the vast majority of American workers have seen their wages stagnate or go down. And Republican colleagues on the floor, and I want to show a chart that was used over and over again on the floor in the Senate, promising hardworking middle-class families that by giving the top 1% and largest corporations big tax giveaways, that they'd get at least $4,000 in higher wages. That's what we saw on the floor. Well, Mr. Chairman, the proof is in your paycheck. That's what we say in Michigan. The proof is in your paycheck. If my Republican colleagues are serious about putting money in the pockets of the middle class, I urge you to write it into the bill. Keep the promise that you are making by writing it into the bill, that this doesn't take effect unless people get at least $4,000 in increased wages. For working families in Michigan, the proof is
Gentlelady's
in their
time has
paycheck.
expired.
And I would move the
So,
conference committee not vote to
Representative
approve
Young.
the conference report until
So,
joint
Representative
tax
Young.
and the Congressional Budget
Gentlelady's
Office
time has
determined
expired.
that
So,
in
Representative Young.
2020, increased average
Gentlelady,
wages will
the
go
time
up
has
by at
expired.
least $4,000.
Thank you, Senator.
I've made
So,
a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Young,
I would
you are
appeal the ruling
recognized.
of the chair, Mr.
So,
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. So, members will be respectful of each other's time.
Thank you,
Let's
Mr.
set that
Chairman,
example.
and thank you, the chairman from the Senate, Orrin Hatch, and thank you, Lisa Murkowski. I will tell you one thing about this. I'm quite pleased to back up Lisa Murkowski's position on the energy part with my chairman, Mr. Bishop, on ANWR. This is crucially important to the nation. It's vitally important. And I can remember when we had good senators, and we had good environmental members that voted for this when we created this bill. The 1002 areas were open. Both sides agreed. Where the oil was, it was never to be a wilderness area. And I constantly hear this nonsense from the other side of the aisle that drives me crazy because you don't read the history. As a dean of the House, I have a little history of how things should be done, how they were done, and why they can still be done. Most of you never participated at all because you wouldn't participate when you were asked, House and Senate side. That's not good legislation. That's TV legislation. You're playing to the cameras. Thank God, Mr. Chairman, I asked unanimous consent, and my written statement will be submitted. But thank God, because this is not in my statement, thank God I'm wearing my cowboy boots today. You know why cowboys wear cowboys boots? To keep their damn pants clean from the horse manure that comes from people that don't know what the hell they're talking about. Now, you can have all the different opinion you want about this. I don't believe, in fact, I'm sure you're wrong. But consequently, if we're wrong, you ought to be happier than the devil. You ought to be real happy. You can say, look what the Republicans did. Look what they did. They hurt you. They hurt your economy. You don't have as much money if you're right, Madam Senator. If that's right, then you can brag about it. But we happen to be right, and this country comes back and does as it should and be given the opportunity to advance so we can have the real jobs, not government jobs. So we can do it with the freedom. That's what we need. This bill does it. And I want to thank all the conferees for working on it. Those who don't agree with you will have your chance to vote on it. You can vote no. If it doesn't work, blame us. But it does work, say, God, they did a great job. Let's be honest with ourselves. I yield back.
Senator Portman, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me start by thanking you for your civility and your leadership, Chairman Brady. And look, I think everyone around this table would have to agree that for years and years we've been talking about doing exactly what's in this bill. We've been talking about middle-class tax cuts, and really for the past decade or so there hasn't been an increase in wages, and yet there have been increases in expenses. Primarily, for most families, the biggest expense is health care. And that middle-class squeeze is real, so middle-class tax cuts are appropriate. And that's in this bill. And we're going to hear from Tom Bartold in a minute, and I agree with my good friend Debbie Stabenow, who is a good friend. The proof is in the paycheck, and people are going to see it. They're withholdings. They're going to see it in January if this thing passes. And that's real. If you're a family living in Ohio, the average tax cut for a median family income in Ohio is $2,375. And by the time this conference committee ends up, it may be more than that. And that's the proof in the pudding. And, you know, we can go back and forth as to whether that's high enough. Earlier, someone saying that's not enough. I mean, you're living paycheck to paycheck. That's a big deal. Big deal. And a lot of our constituents are. We've also talked for years about a more competitive tax code that enables our workers to compete around the world. And it is irresponsible that here in Washington, D.C., we've allowed for the last 31 years a tax code that says, you know what, if you're an American worker, you've got to compete with one hand tied behind your back because of our tax code. A recent study came out showing 4,700 American companies have become foreign companies in the last 13 years because of our tax code, who otherwise would be American companies if we had passed this bill. They set a competitive rate and territorial system, they'd be American companies. So I know there's concerns about, is the base erosion tough enough in here? Let me tell you,
The status quo is not working. We are losing jobs and investment every day overseas, and American workers are bearing the brunt of that. And the statistics are there. And last year, 3 times as many companies were taken over by foreign companies as American companies buying those foreign companies. So it's happening. It's happening in your district. It's happening in your state. Companies don't like to talk about it, but it's true. And by the way, when they leave, you know what they do? They take their jobs and investment with them. We did a study in the Permanent Subcommittee Investigations, bipartisan study, and we have example after example of companies that chose to invert, who went overseas, and they didn't just go overseas with the headquarters. They took jobs and investment with them. Doesn't count the bigger problem, which is companies getting acquired by foreign companies. So this is what's happening, and that's what this tax reform is intended to reverse, and I believe it will. I strongly believe that. We had a bipartisan working group 2.5 years ago. There were 5 of them, one for every area of the tax code. So the notion is we haven't looked at tax reform. This is new. You know, bipartisan working groups in the Finance Committee. I know you've done this in the Ways and Means Committee as well. Those bipartisan working groups
Gentleman's time is
came up with different proposals, and on the international side, Chuck Schumer and I co-chaired it. This is where we came out.
Gentleman's
what this
time
bill
has
says.
expired. Thank you. Senator Menendez, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate my colleague from Alaska's comments. I had the privilege of serving with him here. But when you create the manure, you have to walk in it. So let me just say that the reality is that middle-class families in New Jersey, they know that this is a big, fat, wet kiss to corporations, including corporations that are foreign corporations, at the expense of working middle-class families that are left behind. And referring to the bills as we know them, because I don't know what bill you've negotiated, but referring to the bills as passed at least, 96% of families making under $10,000 per year in 2019, that bill will either raise taxes on them or keep them the same. But in contrast, it would provide at least $500 tax cut to over 80% of those who make over $1 million per year. So the single mom working full-time in a low-paying job, earning less than $10,000 per year, they may very well see their taxes go up or stay the same. But for the incredibly fortunate few, making over $1 million per year, over 80% of them are going to see a $500 tax cut at a minimum. Look at the state and local tax deduction, which 1.8 million New Jerseyans, a full 40% of my state, uses to avoid being double taxed on the same dollar, deducting a total of $32 billion. Do the House and Senate bills preserve the state and local tax deductions for corporations? Yes. Do the House and Senate bills preserve the state and local taxes for individuals and families? No. So to me, this perfectly encapsulates the warped sense of priorities this bill promotes. Whenever there was a decision, whatever trade-offs needed to be made, corporations always won and the middle class always lost. And we're trying to decide between corporations losing the SALT deduction or middle-class families losing it. They put corporations ahead of people. I don't see that as pro-growth. And only in Washington does expiring, vanishing, individual limited tax cuts to fund permanent corporate tax cuts is viewed as helping the middle class. And only in Washington is raising the debt by $1.5 to $2.3 trillion when you add interest is a view as to how we create economic growth, when that will ultimately be used to go after the very programs that the middle class depend upon, to have their parents in a nursing home, to take care of the seniors who help build families and communities, for those who are disabled in their families, and which we see the Speaker has already said that's priority number 1 next year. That's what we're going to use the $1.5 trillion added to the debt already. That, in my mind, is not a pro-growth strategy. And for all my friends that I've listened to for the better part of 25 years being chicken hawks, well, I mean, deficit hawks, they've become chicken hawks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Upton, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As everyone in this room knows, our tax laws have not been updated in 31 years, and I've personally heard countless stories from folks across Michigan impacted by a tax code that is outdated, unwieldy, too often rewards those at the very top at the cost of regular folks. And it's become abundantly clear that the status quo is a major drag on our economy and on Michigan families struggling to get by. I would also note that the largest employer in one of my counties moved across the ocean to take advantage of their lower corporate rates. This bill will change that. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will make our tax code simpler, fair, easier to understand, and I support efforts to advance pro-growth, pro-American tax reform and relief. And hopefully the days of anemic 1% real growth are over. Also, I want to make note of my strong support to include medical deductions as part of the tax code. I think that's very important. Now let me turn to the Senate's oil and gas provisions in Title II. I support the ANWR provisions, though I wish that they could have been drafted in a way that would have preserved the full $1.1 billion that expected to be generated from lease sales. I also support lifting the caps on offshore oil revenue sharing for Gulf states as long as they're paid for responsibly. I'm not opposed to using SPRO as a pay-for, but any new drawdowns have to be carefully considered in light of our existing obligations. We're already using SPRO to pay for the last budget deal, highways, and 21st Century Cures, which was signed by President Obama a year ago today. Under my chairmanship of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Congress authorized a series of drawdowns that will reduce SPRO's inventory from almost 700 million barrels to close to 500 million barrels over the next 10 years, provided that the sales do not limit the ability of the SPRO to prevent or reduce the adverse impact of an energy supply shortage. And before I authorized those drawdowns, I wanted to make sure that the Department of Energy completed a long-range strategic review and that we are simultaneously investing in modernization program to clear the maintenance backlog and ensure that SPRO can meet its mission objectives. Mr. Chairman, with those concerns noted, I'll close by saying in my home state of Michigan, we're known for our blue-collar work ethic. We all strongly believe that our tax code ought to be fair and rewards hard work and playing by the rules, and with this effort, we'll deliver a modernized 21st century tax code that is built specifically for economic growth, Michigan middle-class families, and putting America's interests first. Working together, we can and we will provide tax reform and relief for all Americans. It's about time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Senator Scott, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, millions of Americans feel as if Washington isn't listening. Mr. Chairman, so many of our American friends, family members, feel like they're invisible. This tax reform process is an opportunity for us to say to them, we see you. We hear you. As you know, Mr. Chairman, you and I both grew up in single-parent households. My mom worked as a nurse's aide, which means that she flipped patients, turned patients, and she cleaned bedpans. Sometimes 16 hours a day, a few days a week, and then 8 hours a day, a couple days a week. Mr. Chairman, when I think about tax reform, it's a bottom-up exercise, not a top-down exercise for me. I think about the fact, Mr. Chairman, that today in America, the average single mom makes around $41,000 a year. And when we talk about tax reform for that single mom, we're talking about cutting her tax burden by 75%. We're talking about delivering to her more than $1,400 a year. When we think about our friends and our family members who are the typical Americans making around $73,000 a year, Mr. Chairman, we're talking about a 60% cut, $2,200 left in their paychecks so they can make decisions about a meal out, about a movie on the weekends, about playing in one more sport a year because they have a little more margin in their paychecks to make these decisions. Perhaps for folks who are fighting for a Republican form of tax reform or a Democrat form of tax reform, maybe all of this sounds good for the base. But for the average American in the average place who simply wants to know, how can I keep more of my hard-earned money? That's the question I want to answer. It's in making sure that our proposals delivers to them an increase in their paycheck that reflects the fact that we have confidence in their ability to make better decisions for their families. Mr. Chairman, the thing that changed my economic life was becoming a small business owner, and I will tell you that in a similar fashion, today, this week, a recent survey said that 7,000 employers would increase wages and benefits. Almost as many said that they would also increase wages. Mr. Chairman, I know my time is running out. I don't want to hear regular order on your side or their side. I will simply say that America's future is brighter.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Senators Carper, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Let me just start off by saying, colleagues, what a joy it is to serve in the Senate with Tim. And he is a gift, I think, from the people of South Carolina to our body, the United States Senate. He mentioned his mom. One of the things, as I understand it, the legislation that certainly came out of the Senate Finance Committee for families that are making about $30,000 a year, they realize tax reductions the first couple of years, but not after 2019. $40,000 a year, they realize tax reductions for several years beyond that, but not forever. And so I ask us to keep that in mind. Sitting here, this is my first conference committee in quite a while. My service in the House and my service in the Senate was interrupted for 8 years. I got to be governor of Delaware. But I remember finally my first conference committee, and I was on the banking committee, and we met, and Democrats and Republicans had worked in the House and the Senate actually worked together to craft our bills. And the amendment, the bill of the House Banking Committee that we were conferencing on included my amendments, other amendments, Tom Ridge and other people like that. And we actually offered during the conference committee bipartisan amendments to change the conference report, and did. It was a wonderful exercise. It's one I remember fondly to this day. After that was over, I got to go be governor of Delaware for a while, Mr. Chairman, and during those 8 years, at 8 years, we cut taxes 7 out of 8 years. But every year that we cut taxes, we also balanced the budget. And during those 8 years, we paid down some of our debt. And during those 8 years, we actually ended up with AAA credit ratings for the first time in state history. And more jobs were created in those 8 years than any 8-year period in the history of the state of Delaware before or since. I didn't create one of them. But what I did as the governor of our state focused on how to create a nurturing environment for job creation, job preservation. And that's what we ought to be doing here in the House and in the Senate. And that includes infrastructure writ large, not just roads, highways, bridges, ports, rail, airports, broadband deployment. How do we use money to actually leverage more investments in R&D that can actually be commercialized and turned into job creation? How can we use money to create more affordable energy, whether it happens to be carbon free or carbon low? Those are the things we focused on to good effect. I've asked my colleagues in the Finance Committee, probably tired of hearing me say this, Mr. Chairman, but I always ask 4 questions when people approach me with ideas to reform our tax code. Number 1, is it fair? Is it fair? Number 2, does it promote economic growth and job creation? Number 3, does it make the tax code less complex or more complex? Number 4, what does it do to the deficit? And for me, the thing that's most painful, and Fred Upton's left, but Fred and I used to, Fred's right here, he and I used to focus with Kasich and others, Tim Penny, we used to focus forever on deficit reduction. We were the deficit hawks in the House at the time. And the thing that I find most troubling about this, after 8 years into an economic expansion, we're not paying down debt, which is what we should be. We're going to increase it. And for me, the recovering state treasurer, recovering governor, for me, that is actually the most troubling thing of all. It doesn't have to be this way. It does not have to be this way. And it is painful for me as I'm a recovering governor, but I also am a recovering deficit hawk from Delaware, to see it work out this way when we could have done it together. Old African-American proverb, if you want to go fast, travel alone. If you want to go far, travel together. And it's just, I think, a shame that we have not traveled together down this path. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Shimkus, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What an honor to be here, especially with my classmates in the 105th Congress. We've got Chairman Brady, we've got Senator Thune, and Senator Stabenow, so it's great to serve with you. I also want to thank the Senate for adding Anwar and the SPRO. These positions allow me to be a conferee. Otherwise, I'd be watching like most people. So now we all have to be accountable for our voters. And I've always pushed for and promoted a fair, flatter, simpler tax code, especially for the individuals. In my district, 80% currently file without itemizing. Under the House bill, that amount will go to 90% of all my individual filers will not itemize. And they'll be able to use this simple postcard which I know many of you have seen. Now, I've carried it around a whole year, and I'm hoping that I can finally start sending these to my constituents instead of carrying this for them to file their tax return on. On the corporate side, let's lower the rate, and let's reduce the special interest loopholes and create jobs. It's as simple as that, and that's what I carry back to my district. ANWR is a flat coastal plain the size of South Carolina. And if and when drilling begins, the footprint will be the size of a football field. Thank you, Alaskans, for that. And the best strategic petroleum reserve our nation has is our ability to explore, discover, and recover, which is happening every day. So selling some SPRO is not a big deal for me. Let me finish with this, thanking Chairman Brady and your staff for their hard work. I got a response from one of my constituents who's a self-identified skeptic, responding to my newsletter, and he said, I did the math on my taxes as a retired police officer on a pension and working part-time, and my wife working part-time. Estimating a gross income of $76,000, married, filing jointly under current law, we would pay $6,502. Under the proposed changes, our tax liability drops to $5,592, saving us $910. I'm from a pretty poor district, but I also have some successful people. I also spoke to another constituent who has over $100 million sitting overseas, just waiting to be returned to Illinois to create jobs and put people back to work. So I appreciate the work we've done. I look forward to finishing the conference and getting these things on the floor. I yield back balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Senator Toomey, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, I think people viewing and listening to this debate might really wonder which version of this tax cut and reform bill should they believe. Is it the tax increase on middle and lower income families, as some of our Democratic colleagues has characterized it, or is it the tax cut that my Republican colleagues and I have described it as? So let me just suggest that actions speak louder than words. There's a relatively simple way to get to the truth of this. The first is we're just a few weeks away from hopefully having this in law. And when that happens, take a look at your paycheck. Your withholding is going to go down, and your take-home pay is going to go up. So the proof is going to be in the pudding, as I say, very, very soon. There's another way we could view this debate, Mr. Chairman. And for our House members who were not present at the Senate vote-a-rama on our bill, let me just share a little bit of history. We were hearing the same rhetoric, that this is a terrible, awful tax increase on low and middle income families. And then one of our Democratic senators offered an amendment to take what we did, our tax cuts on low and middle income families, and make it permanent. Now, if this is a big tax increase, of course, they'd all vote no, right? Well, in fact, every single Democratic senator voted in favor of our legislation, our substantive tax cuts for low and middle income families. When they had to go on record, they went on record endorsing what we did, and in fact, urging us to make it permanent, which I hope we'll be able to do. So I would suggest that actions speak louder than words. Let me also talk a little bit about the growth, Mr. Chairman. We've got a modest net tax cut. It's on the order of 2% of projected revenue over the next 10 years. But that's a misleading way to think about it. It's really a very dramatic tax reform. It's a restructuring of our tax incentives that is going to encourage a huge increase in invested capital. Invested capital, what that means is business putting money to work, buying equipment, buying vehicles, buying machinery, buying the kinds of tools that allow them to grow the productive capacity of their business. And all of those things require workers to build and require workers to operate. That's why this is going to put increased demand on wages. And when you do that at a time when unemployment is something on the order of 4%, you necessarily put upward pressure on wages, bring people back into the workforce. And what we are going to do with this bill is we're going to make sure it is going to happen that labor is going to have an increasing share of the wealth this country produces because of the demands we're going to put for additional workers. This is terrific policy for the people we all represent. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership in this and look forward to its prompt passage.
Thank you, Senator. This time I'll turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff, the Joint Committee on Taxation, for a brief overview. Yes, Senator.
The Congresswoman said, Ms. Black, that you all were still going back and forth with respect to the details of the tax plan. When would our conference have a chance to ask questions about the real bill?
So, Senators, you know, when the conference committee is filed at the end of this week, we will all have an opportunity as legislators to review the legislation, deliberate upon it, and then vote in the House and the Senate.
That's not the conference committee. $10 trillion worth of tax changes.
So
We're
what
not
is your
getting a chance-
parliamentary inquiry, Senator?
Well, I think you answered it. We are not going to get a chance as a conference committee
Thank you.
to ask questions
So,
about $10 trillion
at this
worth
time-
of tax policy changes.
Thank you, Senator. At this time, I turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff, Joint Committee on Taxation, for a brief overview of the key differences between the House and the Senate versions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I would ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold,
Mr.
you're
Chairman,
recognized.
I just wanted to clarify
So-
with what Senator Wyden asked.
Thank you,
Are you indicating
Madam
we won't?
Senator.
Will we be actually being asked to vote yes or no in the conference
Yeah.
committee
So
before
I think that question's
we
been
receive the
asked
bill?
and answered. And
So
so
you-
now.
So when do we
will
vote on that? Are
continue.
we going to vote as a
Yes,
conference
when the
committee?
conference committee comes to the Senate, you'll have an opportunity
So
to
as a
deliberate
conference
and vote.
committee, we're not going to get an opportunity to vote
Again,
before we see the bill.
Conference rules, efforts
I'm
finished.
very confused. I've been
be
on
done.
other
Oh,
conference
conference
committees.
rules.
Thank you.
I'm
So,
just-
gang, regular order.
So
We're
we
going to
won't
respect
be
each
voting?
other's
I'm
rights.
just wondering if we're, what are we doing
Gentlelady,
here?
regular order will prevail.
And
Mr. Barthold, you're recognized.
Thank you,
So we're
Chairman.
not voting?
This is not regular order. This is not regular order. This is not the kind of conference committee I grew up with. We actually had the text of the
Thank
bill
you for your
before us.
comments.
We had
Senator,
the opportunity to
so
offer
we're going to
Democratic and Republican
continue regular
amendments
order.
together. That is regular order.
And Senator, let us all remind each other, we are on this conference committee. When this report is presented, you'll have the opportunity to disagree with it and to not sign it and have your voice heard as they are today.
When do we
Then
have the
you'll an
opportunity to offer
vote
amendments
for
to
it.
the conference report?
Senator, we are going to continue this.
That's regular order.
report.
With all due respect, that is
So-
regular order.
Senator, you're out of order. We're going to respect each other. Mr. Barthold.
I'm not the only one here out of
Regular
order.
order.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Brady, Chairman Hatch, members of the conference committee. The staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation has prepared two documents to assist you in reviewing the two bills that are the subject of this conference, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The two documents are JCX 64 and JCX 65. The former provides a textual walkthrough of similarities and differences in the two bills, and the latter is a revenue table that compares in a side-by-side fashion the provisions of the two the respective legislation. The legislation is substantial, makes many changes in terms of the taxation of individuals, taxation of business income, and changes our taxation of income earned from investments abroad. I'll try to be brief, but as I noted, it is substantial, so I'll probably be a little bit longer than when I've presented material before the two respective committees. I'll start with the individual income tax, and I'll try and highlight some similarities and noted differences in the general structure of the two bills. One overriding difference between the legislation passed by the House and the legislation passed by the Senate is that, as a general matter, most provisions of the individual title of the Senate legislation expire after calendar year 2025. Both bills repeal the personal exemption. Both bills nearly double the standard deduction. In terms of tax rates for the individual income tax structure, the House provides 4 rates, ranging from a low rate of 12% to a top rate of 39.6%, while the Senate provides 7 income tax brackets, with the lowest bracket being 10%, the highest bracket being 38.5%. Both bills expand the child tax credit. In the House, it would increase the value of the child tax credit to $1,600 per eligible child, and in the Senate to $2,000 per eligible child. In addition, the House bill provides a family credit, or a credit for the taxpayer's spouse, and other dependents in the household, of $300. That would expire after 5 years. In the Senate, there is an additional credit for non-child dependents of $500. Both bills make some substantial changes in the deductions that certain taxpayers may be permitted to elect to itemize. The House and the Senate both retain itemized deductions for charitable contributions, mortgage interest, although they make reforms to the amount of interest allowable, and provide for a deduction of property taxes limited to a total value of
$10,000. In addition, the Senate legislation would provide an itemized deduction for large medical expenses. The alternative minimum tax for individuals would be repealed under the House legislation. It would be retained under the Senate legislation, but the exemption amounts would be increased. The Senate legislation also reduces to zero the penalty for failure to purchase qualified medical insurance, referred to as the individual mandate. Both legislation would make substantial changes in the estate and gift taxes. The House would double the present law exemption amount and then repeal those taxes after 2024, making a change in the gift tax at that time. The Senate legislation doubles the present law exemption amount. With respect to business taxes, I'll first describe briefly taxation of pass-through business entities and then C corporations, and then try and speak briefly about the measurement of business income. There's substantial changes made in the legislation in all those areas. With respect to pass-through business incomes, the House provides that there would be a maximum rate of tax on the qualified business income of 25%, and for taxpayers whose income would otherwise be in brackets under the House-passed legislation less than 25%, it would provide reduced tax rates of 11%, 10%, and 9%. The Senate legislation takes a different approach. Rather than having a maximum tax rate, it would provide a 23% deduction for qualifying business income against whatever the tax rate would otherwise be. Both legislation have certain definitions which limit the qualifying amount of income or exclude certain types of income from the benefits provided. In terms of the taxation of C corporations, the House would provide a 20% tax rate. That tax rate would be effective beginning after 2017. The Senate also would provide a 20% tax rate, but in the Senate legislation, that tax rate would not be effective until after 2018. In the House, the corporate alternative minimum tax would be repealed. In the Senate, the corporate alternative minimum tax would be retained. In terms of defining business income, both the House and Senate would make substantial changes in capital cost recovery. Both would provide essentially 100% expensing of capital investment for the first 5 years of the ensuing budget period. The Senate legislation would differ from the House in that it would phase out that benefit over the succeeding 4 years. The House legislation would return to present law makers cost recovery after 5 years. Both the House and the Senate make substantial changes to expensing for smaller businesses that's provided under Code Section 179. For a 5-year period, the House legislation would provide up to $5 million worth of capital equipment could be expensed, thereafter returning to present law levels. The Senate legislation would permanently provide for up to $1 million worth of capital expenditure to be increased annually. Those figures in both bills are indexed for inflation. Both the legislation of the House and the Senate would also change accounting, uniform capitalization rules, providing safe harbors for small businesses by unifying the definition of small business for those purposes. In the House, the definition would be based at $25 million worth of gross receipts. In the Senate, $15 million worth of gross receipts. The legislation in both the House and the Senate place limitations on the amount of interest that may be claimed. Both would deny up to 30% of interest, but would define the limitation in different ways that we can talk about if that's of interest to the members in question time. Another substantial structural change that the House and the Senate would make is that they would limit the amount of net operating losses that may be claimed against current year taxable income. In the case of the House, it would be limited to 90% of taxable income. The Senate, 90% of taxable income, although after the year 2022, it would be limited to 80% of taxable income. Also, substantial differences, as I noted initially, in terms of the treatment of income earned from cross-border investments, cross-border business income. In general, Both the House bill and the Senate bill would shift the United States away from what's characterized as worldwide taxation to what's referred to as territorial taxation by providing a 100% dividends received deduction. Both bills would provide that for previously untaxed foreign earnings that have been held abroad by U.S. headquartered companies, that there would be a deemed repatriation of those earnings. In the House, the effective tax rates on the deemed on this income that is deemed repatriated would be 7% for for assets held in illiquid form, 14% for liquid or cash-like assets. In the Senate, those rates of tax would be 7.5% and 14.5%. Both bills provide for base erosion protections. The House provides a regime of defined as foreign high return income. It would provide for current year taxation at a 50% rate for certain income earned from intangible investments. There's measures of how we define high return. Senate has a similar provision, which is referred to in the Senate legislation as global intangible low taxed income. It comparably provides a deduction of 50% of that for current inclusion. That deduction would be reduced to 37% after calendar year 2025. Senate legislation, in addition, would provide that for certain income earned in the United States attributable to exploiting intangible assets and sold abroad, the income earned from foreign sources, that there would be a deduction against the U.S. tax base, effectively lowering the tax rate on income earned in the United States by exploiting it in sales abroad. Both bills provide for base erosion protection from inbound, what's referred to as inbound protection. It would make changes in terms of the amount of interest that may be deducted in the United States. Both bills would also provide that certain cross-border transactions between related parties could be subject to an income tax. In the Senate bill, a 10% tax reduced by the amount of regular tax for taxpayers with gross income annually of over $500 million. In the House, it would be similar taxpayers would be able to elect net basis taxation on an expanded definition of their income, which would include some of the income from foreign operation. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my brief walkthrough of where I've tried to highlight the major differences and some of the major similarities when the structure of the underlying tax law has been changed. I'd be happy to answer any question that the members of the Conference Committee might have.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bartow. So we'll begin the second round in consisting of questioning Mr. Bartow, and I'll recognize myself. So we're really focused on growth. Look, we all agree. People are tired of watching American jobs go overseas. We're tired of seeing paychecks stay just stagnant for a decade. We've seen the worst economic recovery in a half a century. So it is time, and growth matters. So, and that's the focus of this, to grow jobs, paychecks in the U.S. economy, leapfrog America back into the lead pack. So you've estimated and analyzed these bills. So can you tell us about how the growth you project from these bills will affect jobs, and how will they affect the after-tax earnings of middle-income taxpayers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you're referring to some of the analysis that the staff, the Joint Committee, carried out as required by House rules and the concurrent budget resolution, talking about potential macroeconomic effects from the legislation. What we've calculated is that some of the effects that you noted are that on average, under the House bill, employment's projected to increase by about 0.5% relative to baseline levels over the period. That means more employment, more labor income. Projected that under the House legislation that the capital stock would be about 0.9% higher on average over the budget period. Greater capital stock helps promote greater labor productivity, which should be reflected in the long run in terms of greater wages. And overall, the effect on the U.S. economy, we projected that the real gross domestic product would on average be about 0.7% higher than under baseline projections. Just to give a frame of reference, current gross domestic product's a little over $19 trillion, and so 0.7% means that on average any 1 year an additional $135 billion worth of gross domestic product, gross national income.
Great. So, growth in jobs, growth in productivity, growth in wages, and growth in the U.S. economy. So most Americans work along Main Street. Can you describe how your estimates show how individuals will benefit from the tax changes on the business side?
Mr. Chairman, we've prepared at the time of that the Ways and Means Committee acted and then the House deliberated some distributional analysis, and our analysis following empirical economic literature attributes some of the benefits from capital growth, from business expansion in terms of benefits to individuals, both in terms of the wage effects that I noted a moment ago, also in terms of returns that they may earn through pension assets.
Mr. Bartol, I'll hold myself strictly to 3 minutes as well. So, Chairman Hatch, you're recognized. Question, Mr. Bartol.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bartol, some of my friends on the other side of the aisle have recently been decrying increases in corporate profits, a phenomenon which has generally been taking place for decades now. What they typically fail to also mention is that household wealth has also generally risen for decades, even when adjusted for inflation. Typically, my friends on the other side of the aisle suggest that rising corporate profits somehow accrue only to the so-called, quote, rich, unquote, whether it is a corporate CEO or rich stockholder, but this seems to ignore the fact that equity valuations of corporations have contributed a great deal to retirement savings of pension holders, a large number of whom are in the middle class. Now, this has been a huge source of growing wealth in this country. Dr. Bartol, if corporate profits and equity valuations increase as a result of the pro-growth and pro-middle class tax reforms that the Senate and the House have passed, does that mean only the so-called, quote, rich, unquote, will benefit?
Well, Chairman Hatch, I don't like labeling rich since it's not clear where that means in terms of incomes. It is the case that individuals in the top half of the income distribution own more assets and probably more business assets, but individuals across all parts of the income distribution, as you noted, will benefit from increase in pension assets if they own their own homes, increase in the value of their homes. So it's not the case that if corporate profits increase, that only means that there's a benefit to the very highest income individuals in the United States.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Neal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthol, do you remember at any time attending a hearing on H.R. 1 in the House of Representatives to discuss the Republican tax plan?
Well, Mr. Neal, I don't know if it counts as a hearing, but we did have markup for.
Well, that doesn't count as a hearing where we had a chance to go back and forth with you?
If your question is subsequent to Ways and Means marking up and reporting the legislation, there was not a hearing on that legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Barthol. So there was not a hearing, so we might confirm that we did not have one hearing on this tax bill in the Ways and Means Committee. Now, Mr. Barthol, one of the problems we have, and I know this is not an easy position for you, but one of the problems we have now is that we're trying to respond to a bill that already passed the House of Representatives here. We know about the bill. We know what's in it. The challenge that we should use the Conference Committee for is to figure out how to discuss what the final package apparently is going to look like. There's no opportunity to do that. There's no give and take. You know, Senator Carper said, like myself, we attended and participated in conference committees at one time. The S&L Conference Committee, I was on it. We had a chance to go back and forth with amendments, and actually it was very amenable to a fluid conversation. Both sides reached agreement, and we passed eventually something out of the House and the Senate that the American people could live with. That has not happened in this instance here. Now, Secretary Mnuchin has indicated that early on there would be no absolute tax cut for the upper class. Mr. Barthold, is there any couple or individuals that will be making $1 million that in this instance here are going to see a tax cut?
Mr. Neely, the simple answer is yes. I'll point you to a couple of factors in the legislation, both in the House and in the Senate. Individuals who are owners, either passive owners or active owners of pass-through business income, could, if they currently have an income over $1 million, could see their taxes reduced because, as I noted, in the House, there's a maximum tax rate on income attributable to those businesses, and in the Senate, there's a deduction.
Tom, just because I only have 32 seconds left, what happened in this? What happened in the House bill to New Markets tax credits?
It is effectively repealed by no new allocations after.
And the historic tax credit?
It also would be repealed, sir.
And the orphan drug tax credit?
It would be repealed, sir.
And the private activity bond?
The private activity bond authorization also repealed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Brady has now confirmed that this is a reality show version of a conference committee. We're not going to get a chance to ask questions about $10 trillion worth of tax changes in a real bill. So, Mr. Barthold, I have some questions for you that go to the issue of the middle class getting the shaft here, and I just would like, if we could, to see if we could get some yes or no answers. Is it correct, Mr. Barthold, that in the Senate bill, the individual tax changes are temporary, except for the Affordable Care Act changes and the change to reduce inflation? Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator Wyden.
Thank you. Second, on this issue of wages, I asked you specifically in the committee about this idea that the Senate bill would generate $4,000 worth of additional wage per worker. You said that that was very unlikely, and you referred us to some tables. Is that still your position?
I still stand by that statement, sir.
Great. Compared to current law, isn't it correct that millions of families, millions of middle-class families walking on an economic tightrope are going to have a tax increase due to those expiring provisions that I just mentioned?
The effect of changing the inflation adjustment will have the effect of slowing those adjustments, so that there could, upon expiration of the reduced tax rates and other features of the Senate legislation, you will see higher taxes for some families.
What is the revenue impact of a 1% point decrease in the top rate?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'll have to get back to you. I'll provide that information to all the members of the
Who benefits the most from a cut in the top rate? What's the percentage of taxpayers?
The percentage, I'll also have to respond. The top rate is under the top 5%.
Under 5%. Okay. One last question, again to highlight the double standard here. We're writing into black letter law permanent reductions for multinational corporations and having temporary provisions for working families. Isn't in the House bill, because there's some symmetry with the Senate bill, isn't the House bill, the child tax credit expansions and the family credit temporary?
The child tax credit expansion is permanent.
In the House bill.
In the House bill. The family credit that I described is for 5 years only in the House bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Nunes, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, let me just go over the two bills, and maybe you can help us illuminate the differences. And I know you walked through them, but I'm specifically interested first in the Senate bill that has a $15 million provision for definition for small business and $25 million in the House bill. Can you quickly just walk us through those differences and the differences in the expensing provisions? And possibly, you probably don't have this number, but I'd be interested in the cost differential between the two bills.
The cost differential is actually
Well, specifically on those provisions.
no, on those provisions is available in JCX 65, I believe. The side by side, we showed the effects of the capital cost recovery and the uniform definition of business. On if you look on page 5 of JCX 65, the cost recovery provision. The expanded bonus depreciation in the House bill, estimated 10-year total of $25 billion. Senate bill, $96.7 billion. The small business reforms, so starting with Section 179 provision, which is also an expensing provision. The House, $11.4 billion. The Senate, $24 billion. In terms of the small business accounting method reform that you just highlighted, where the House has the $25 million definition and the House the $15 million definition. The estimated revenue loss from the House legislation is $30 billion, and from the Senate legislation, $27.6 billion.
So adding used equipment, the used equipment definition to the to either bill is not going to be a large cost recovery.
It will not be a large. It will be under $5 billion. Under $5 billion.
Okay. Also, Mr. Bartle, the House had a 25% passive investment rate.
That's a maximum rate, and it's a lower rate for individuals whose income would otherwise be in brackets below the 25% tax bracket.
And what's the major differences in 30 seconds between the House and Senate bill on the passive rates?
Well, it's really in the structure, in that as you just noted, it's a maximum rate of tax, and then there's lower rates for individuals whose income would otherwise be in the lower brackets. In the Senate legislation, it's a fixed percentage deduction against whatever the income is in those brackets.
Thank you, Mr. Bartle. And Mr. Chairman, I think both the House and Senate are very close on these provisions, and they are quite critical for economic growth.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Senator Engie, you're recognized for question, Mr. Bartle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartold, I've long been a proponent of making our tax system simpler, particularly for individuals. In these bills, are there provisions that would make compliance with the tax system easier for individuals?
Senator Enzi, on the individual side, under present law, we project that about 29–30% of taxpayers itemize. We project that under either the House bill or the Senate bill, those numbers would fall to 5 to 6%. So to the extent that itemization requires additional record keeping and verification, that'd be an element, a potentially substantial element of simplification, sir.
Thank you. Move to the international tax reform, which would have efforts to encourage U.S. headquartered multinational companies to stay in the United States versus locating overseas. What types of changes under the bills would you expect to incentivize U.S. companies to remain in the United States?
The legislation has a couple of different features, and then again it varies some House to Senate. Top line, to the extent that a lower corporate tax rate is beneficial to being located in the United States compared to other countries which presently have lower statutory tax rates than does the United States. That reduction would provide an incentive to invest in the United States, remain headquartered in the United States. In the Senate legislation, there's also the additional benefit to investment in the United States from the foreign-derived intangible income provision that I briefly described. That provides an additional preference for producing and selling in the United States as serving foreign markets.
Thank you. I'm always very impressed at your ability to cover these complex situations and make them sound and make them into answers that are understandable. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Levin, you recognize the question, Mr. Bartow.
Mr. Bartow, we very much respect you. So let me ask you some questions about facts. And we've sent these to you. It's the estimate that in 2019, 12.7 million people with incomes under 200,000 under the House bill and 12.9 million under the Senate bill would pay higher taxes. Is that estimate essentially correct?
Mr. Levin, yes, you asked about some work that we did on the House bill and on the Senate bill, where we calculated percentage of taxpayers by some income categories who would see tax increases or tax decreases, or essentially no change. And the summary that you've presented is accurate, sir.
It's accurate. And as to 2027, it's the estimate that we sent to you that by 2027, 32.5 million people with incomes under 200,000 would have higher taxes under the House bill and 37.8 million under the Senate bill. Is that estimate that we sent to you based on your earlier work essentially correct?
In 2027?
Yes.
In 2027, roughly 23.8 million house tax filing units would have a tax increase of at least $100 or more.
Okay. My good friend, and he is, Mr. Portman, talked about proof in the pudding. Those facts show what will be in the pudding, and I think the answer is more taxes. Let me ask you, is it correct that the average tax cut in 2019 for filers within income over 1 million or more under the House bill and Senate bills would be 73,000 under the House bill and 59,000 under the Senate bill? 73,000 under the House, 59,000 under the Senate bill.
Average. I'm told you're correct.
Noem's time has expired.
Let me just say, it gives a lie to this
You want to
notion
thank
this is a
you,
middle-
Mr. Levin. All time has expired. So,
he took a
Mr.
good part of
Roskam,
my
you're
time.
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Bartold. When you attended the markup of H.R. 1 in the House before the Ways and Means Committee, did you recall whether the minority offered any amendments that you would characterize as comprehensive? In other words, big, bold, overwhelming, a comprehensive approach. Were you asked to opine on anything of that magnitude?
Well, Mr. Roskam, I shouldn't characterize member amendments as
Well, let me ask it this way. Do you recall, oh, this is kind of fun. It's like deposition days. Do you recall, you recall being there that day, don't you, Mr. Bartold? So here's my point. I think that there were a number of amendments that were offered by our friends on the other side of the aisle. My recollection is that the overwhelming majority of those, I'm not sure if every one was, but if there were a dozen, let's say, the lion's share of them were a restoration of what? The status quo. It was to put something back, to put something back, to put something back. In other words, a minority party that has had access, the same type of staff, the same type of background, the same type of wherewithal and resources and capacity, stepped back from the opportunity to offer something, an amendment in the nature of the substitute. Now, that's their prerogative. That's absolutely their prerogative. But I want to go back to the the editorial that I mentioned a minute ago during my time that's now in the record, the Chicago Tribune. I want to just read quickly 2 quick paragraphs, and this is their December 5th editorial. This is the Chicago Tribune, the title of which, from the editors, "This Tax Deal Will Make America More Prosperous." A vote against this bill is a vote to maintain America as it looks today. Now, sub-paragraph, Roskam, that is, maintain the status quo. And the status quo, everyone has stipulated, by the way, is miserable. Back to the text. Are you happy with the way the state of the economy has been since the end of the Great Recession 8 years ago? You shouldn't be. First, discard the impact of the market boom fattening your 401k since Trump's election, because that's due in part in anticipation of tax reform. Kill tax reform, and you lose market momentum. Here's what you're left with: a nation that has grown at 2% or less a year. That's not fast enough to boost stagnant wages, increase job participation, or improve U.S. competitiveness versus other countries. Passing this tax reform should get the economy to a steady 3% growth. At that rate, the country generates trillions of dollars in new economic activity, creates jobs, and increases household income, money to be spent or saved. Last point. It is the status quo that has created so much division among us. It is the status quo that has excluded people at the bottom end of the economic scale. It is the status quo that has benefited a great number of people who friends and foes are critics of. We need to do this, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, Senator Murkowski. Recognize the question, Mr. Bartol.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was suggested earlier that with regards to Title II and specifically the development within the 1002 area of ANWR, that this provision was unpopular, it was unnecessary, we don't need it because we are continuing to see exports of oil. Mr. Chairman, rather than asking a direct question to Mr. Barthold, I would like to ask for permission to include for the record here testimony that we had received from Mr. Matthew Rexford, who is the tribal administrator for the native village of Kaktovik. Kaktovik is the village that is actually located within the 1002 area. You can't have a wilderness if you have a school, a clinic, a road, an airstrip. These are the people who live within the 1002 area. Mr. Rexford was very articulate in his testimony before his committee about the support from the people of Kaktovik, so I would like that included as part of the record.
Without objection.
I would also like to include the testimony of Mr. Richard Glenn from Utqiagvik. He has outlined why so many Alaska Natives up on the North Slope within the borough in this region support the development up there, so I would like to include that.
Without objection.
I would also like to include the testimony from our governor, who is an independent, our lieutenant governor, who is a Democrat, Alaska Native, both in favor, strong favor of opening up the 1002 area. I would also ask permission to submit the resolution from the Voice of the Arctic Inupiaq. This is a group of people, Mr. Chairman, that have asked that their voices be heard as Alaska Native people who are seeking the opportunity for jobs and development while at the same time maintaining that we have a balance that allows for subsistence lifestyle while at the same time having jobs. So I would ask that that resolution be included.
Without
I would
objection.
further ask, Mr. Chairman, we have a resolution from the North Slope Borough, a letter from the Utqiagvik Inupiaq Corporation, more northern voices to add to that, as well as letters signed by our state senators, Alaska representatives from our legislature, as well as additional letters from national labor organizations, energy security advocates, and many more. And I would ask that they be included as part of today's record.
Thank you. Without objection,
Thank you,
Senator.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mr. Doggett, you're recognized too. So the chairman has responsibility for maintaining order. Chairman has responsibility for maintaining order during committee proceedings. Disruptions won't be tolerated. Audience members who cause them will be removed. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Mr. Barthold, am I correct that you are not able today to discuss any specific provision that Republicans may have agreed upon to include ultimately in the conference report?
Mr. Doggett,
Just yes or no. Can you discuss what they're going to put in the report?
No,
All right, so you can't tell us whether the $65 billion in educational tax incentives that were terminated in the House bill, or the tax on the sick, or the tax on taxes, or the child tax credit, whether that will be in the conference report or not. There was a time when the battle cry of Republicans was, read the bill. Well, they've solved that problem today by not giving us any bill to read and making it clear they don't intend to give us any bill to read before this conference committee is ended. Indeed, I think anyone who has watched the operations of this committee this afternoon, they can see the type of government that I believe Donald Trump envisions for much more than this conference committee. One person is the ruler, and the other are the ruled. One person can say no amendments. One person can say no consideration of any witness to explain the provisions of the bill. And so what we will have here after this trampling of democracy is that sometime on Friday, a bill that has been developed with the Washington special interest in secret in various places across this Capitol, it will be presented. And while I'm clearly upset that I and my colleagues will not have an opportunity to review that bill with care and to ask any of those who wrote it what's in it and what its impact is on the people that I represent, the real concern here is that the American people will not have a chance to really thoroughly review that bill before it's taken up in the Senate and the House next Monday and Tuesday. There's a sense of fear that permeates this conference committee. Yes, there is a concern by some of us, the fear of what it will do to American families and our economy in driving up trillions of dollars of debt. But the real fear is over there. It is the fear that if you don't rush this through with no questions asked, no amendments, no nothing, if the American people really find out what is in this bill, they will reject it and it will never be able to become law. And the only reason they move forward in this high-handed manner, with no time, no opportunity to consider it, is not only because they're desperate to grasp out for a political life preserver after having accomplished nothing in this entire year of any significance, but because they are determined to foist off this monstrosity, this outrageous bill on the American people. Now, I understand while we've been meeting, Donald Trump has already been on television thanking us. I'm sure he's thanking us for the way we're doing it. He's also thanking us for all that he will get out of this bill personally.
We'll continue this committee
we know more about
in
that
its regular
if this
order.
committee hadn't
Thank you,
covered up
Mr.
his
Doggett.
tax
The
return.
gentleman's
I yield
time
back.
has expired. Representative Black, you're recognized to question Mr. Bartol.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthol, this bill, our Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, cuts rates and entices companies to move to the United States and to bring their capital, which will certainly encourage major increases in capital spending to help public and private entities foster economic growth. My question is, can you explain what the original intent of the private activity bonds are, since this is, my understanding, one of the tools that is used for capital improvements? And if you could give us a history of that as we look to change the way they currently are considered.
Private activity bonds originally were issued by some states as industrial development bonds in the mid to late 1960s. And it was a way, it developed, states used the borrowing authority of the states to issue at tax-exempt rates and relend the funds to private investors for a number of different classes of investments. The Congress became concerned about the use of the tax exemption for municipal finance, which had long been for roads, schools, more public purpose, and began to put some limits on state ability to issue private activity bonds. The 1986 Tax Reform Act defined a number of different categories. A large number of the categories of private activity bonds were put under a unified volume cap, limiting, at least within the class of those bonds under the volume cap, a dollar amount of bond authority that states could issue per year. That volume cap is based on the population of the states. Among private activity bonds, there's still a form of the original industrial development bonds that are referred to as small issue manufacturing bonds. It's also you can also issue those for first-time farmers. And then there's mortgage revenue bonds for first-time home buyers. There's multifamily housing bonds. There's a number of other categories. But the essence of it is that a private person is a substantial beneficiary of the benefit of tax-exempt finance.
So originally, really, it was used for public purposes, public infrastructure, schools, hospitals.
The general exemption under Section 103 of the Code for interest on state and local government debt is for governmental bonds. So schools, roads, public hospitals, town hall, and the like.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Cornyn, you're recognized to question Mr. Bartol.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartol, are you aware that the Congressional Budget Office's baseline projection is that the American economy will grow at 1.9% annually over the next 10-year budget window? Are you aware of that?
Yes, that's part of the macroeconomic baseline against which we base all our conventional revenue estimates and from which we base our macroeconomic estimates, sir.
And are you aware that since World War II, the U.S. economy has grown roughly at an average of 3.2%?
Yeah, I'm not positive on the 3.2, but yes, it has grown closer to 3% up.
What do you think the effect of the Senate bill will be on stimulating growth in the American economy above the 1.9% anemic economic projection by the CBO?
Well, Senator Cornyn, as required under the concurrent budget resolution, my colleagues prepared a macroeconomic analysis of the bill as reported by the Finance Committee. Now, there were some substantial changes made by amendment on the Senate floor, but we reported that the bill as reported by the Finance Committee would increase the level of gross domestic product relative baseline forecast by 0.8%, as I'd noted earlier in a response to Chairman Brady. That's worth on a given year relative to our current level of GDP, $140 billion of additional national income.
So while we can quibble about the amount of growth or the rate of growth, there's, in your opinion, this Senate tax bill will generate additional economic growth.
That's the analysis of our macroeconomic modeling, sir. Yes.
And so for our friends who are deficit hawks, which I'm proud to be one, but I do believe that this tax bill will help stimulate economic recovery that will more than offset any deficit. They should be reassured, or at least you would reassure them, that while we can quibble about the amount, there definitely will be, in your opinion, economic growth generated by the Senate tax bill.
Yes, sir. Okay.
So when I got to the Senate, we had a wise senator by the name of Bob Bennett, who from Utah, who told me that he said, one thing I can tell you about CBO estimates is they're always wrong. He said, I can't tell you whether they're too high or too low. And I guess the difficulty is here trying to project what will be the combined impact of the rollback and overregulation, what will be the impact of consumer confidence, which is at a 16-year high, coupled with the tax provisions here.
Thank you, gentlemen. Time has expired. Representative Noem, you recognize the question, Mr. Bartol.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartol, I appreciate all of your hard work that you and your staff have put in over the last several months working on tax reform. I do want to ask you a question about some of the assumptions that you made in your macroeconomic analysis that you and your colleagues on JCT just recently released on Monday. In that analysis, you raised the possibility that taxpayers could have a specific dollar amount to leave to their heirs, and repealing the death tax could allow those taxpayers to reach that target earlier, reducing their incentive to work. And can you briefly tell me why you made that assumption? I mean, I was puzzled by it because I think I'm not alone in this room of people that realizing that higher tax burdens and higher tax rates can disincentivize work, but I've never heard of disincentivizing work by eliminating a tax?
Well, it's not an assumption. What we were discussing in that aspect of JCX 66, which is the report you're referring to, Ms. Noem, is that there's some empirical evidence that there's different motivations behind savings and wealth accumulation among different people. Some people are referred to and seem to show up empirically in the data as target savers. They may have a particular goal that they're trying to achieve for whatever reason, and they can slow their rate of accumulation in response to a higher after-tax
Can you
reduce
give me
taxes,
some
higher
description of what that demographic would be? Because I live in Hamlin County. I've been a farmer my whole life. I don't know of a farmer that would quit in the middle of harvest because they've reached their asset threshold, or a small business owner in Rapid City that would quit taking orders because they've finally reached what they wanted to reach in life. What demographic would just quit once they reach their threshold?
Well, a place where you see it in terms of labor supply is sometimes people choose to retire earlier when they've reached certain accumulations in terms of retirement assets. If they, for example, if they think if I have X, thousands of dollars from which I can buy an annuity that will pay me a stream of income over a period of years, and if they hit that X earlier, they may choose to retire earlier. Obviously, it's not the case with your constituents, and we were not trying to suggest in the report that was uniform behavior. It's just that there's a whole mix of behaviors, and it makes it, it's one of the things that makes it difficult to assess taxpayer behavior when we try to analyze legislation.
In that analysis, was your assumption made then that if the estate tax was fully repealed, it would disincentivize work?
No, we did not make that assumption at all.
Okay. One last question, I wanted to state I'm out of time.
Lady's time
I yield back,
has
Mr. Chairman.
expired. Representative Grijalva, you recognize question, Mr. Bartold.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bartold, I'm kind of, I had questions in terms of preparing to make a case for some of the things included in the House and Senate package. But given the fact that those of us at this conference are existing in some parallel universe where the deal's already been cut, and the deal rigged, and here we are. So, pardon me if I don't ask you any questions, because the relevancy of the questions that I have has to be to the package and making the case for higher education and the $64 billion that are being cut from that, making the case on the petty repeal of $250 deduction for classroom teachers to buy school supplies for their kids, and the list goes on. But so appreciate your time. I think that what we're seeing here today is what the American people have been concerned about. This deal is on these tax cuts. It's not reform. Has been done in secret. It has not been inclusive. There has been limited transparency. And here we are on the eve of votes that are going to happen in both the House and the Senate, sitting here asking questions over documents that have now been merged and a deal's been cut, and none of us at this table are able to review or to ask the witness the questions that we should ask based on what the deal is. In terms of the Arctic Refuge, the National Petroleum Reserve, the companies that we saw last week or 2 weeks ago, they just weren't willing to bid that much for oil and gas leases on the North Slope. 10 million acres were offered. Only $1.2 million were raised, despite having more infrastructure in that area, more oil fields, lower royalty rate than the Arctic Refuge. I've asked the Congressional Budget Office to factor the new data into the score. Since we're using this potential drilling there that's going to generate billions of dollars over the next 10 years to offset some of the tax cuts in this legislation, I should, at the very minimum, if we're going to include this in this package, the Arctic Refuge, then we should be dealing with the same set of facts. But to commit to an offset that does not exist and could be meaningless at the end, I think is a real mistake. And if it's so important, let's deal with it separate and distinct and through regular order in the House and in the Senate if that's necessary. I have no more questions, Mr. Chairman, you're back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. Senator Thune, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just finish where I left off a moment earlier. There was an argument made that Republicans should get 4 Pinocchios for saying that this was going to reduce taxes on middle-income taxpayers. And as I pointed out, we had several Senate Democrats who got up and made public statements or social media platforms said that families making less than $86,100 on average would face a hefty tax hike. This is according to the Washington Post fact checker. Actually, it's the opposite. Most families in that income range would get a tax cut. Any Democrat who spread this claim should delete their tweets and make clear they were in error. And they got 4 Pinocchios for making that statement. Question for Mr. Barthold is, Mr. Barthold, if you double the standard deduction, if you double the child tax credit, and if you lower rates pretty much across the, through the different income groups, what income groups would benefit from those types of changes in tax law?
If you've in doubling the standard deduction, you're creating a zero bracket.
Right.
So for under the Senate legislation, approximately doubling takes it for joint filers to $24,000. So that's $24,000 income, no tax.
Free from tax.
If they have children with a $2,000 child tax credit, there's for one child, that's $2,000 worth of tax that can be offset, which to get $2,000 worth of tax, they'd have to have income of $20,000 within the 10% bracket. So for example, in the example that we're creating, $40,000 worth of income would be tax-free for that household.
Okay. So, and would there be a number of taxpayers that currently have tax liability that under these proposals would no longer have tax liability? Would it take some people completely off the tax rolls?
Yes, it would.
Yeah. So expansion of the zero bracket is going to help people in the lower income categories. It just strikes me that a lot of the attacks that are made by our colleagues on the other side, both in the Senate and the House, on these bills are, they can keep saying it, but it doesn't make it so. I mean, it just doesn't add up. The facts aren't there. One final point. What do I have left, Mr. Chairman? All right, I'll summarize this. I'm looking at one of the distribution charts that you did for us, and that's D 1756. And basically what it points out is after this all takes effect, the burden of taxation is very similar to what it is today through every income group, with one very notable exception, and that is that people over $1 million will pay significantly more than they do today under current law. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cantwell, you recognize the question, Mr. Bartow.
Mr. Bartold, the base erosion anti-abuse tax as it relates to preventing foreign-owned companies and U.S. corporations and affiliates from shifting income abroad. So are you arguing that that doesn't impact the low-income housing tax credit?
I made no statement about that in my summary. No, if your question is, would it affect the low-income housing tax credit if a taxpayer would potentially be could potentially be subject to the base erosion anti-abuse tax if they currently benefit from owning low-income housing tax credit properties, the effect of the tax would be to reduce the benefit from those credits.
So I'm trying to understand this as it relates to because obviously people are putting a fix in here for the R&D tax credit. So they obviously do think it affects, and so why not treat the low-income housing tax credit the same way?
The Senate, as you note, the Senate legislation did provide that research credit under Section 41 would essentially be exempted from the base erosion anti-abuse tax. It would be, within the conference, of course, for the conferees to make a similar sort of adjustment if they thought it was warranted for other credits under Section 45, under Section 42.
Yeah, my point is it does affect it, and we do certainly want to not have a negative impact. My opening statement was about, instead of seeking the 50% increase that I think we really need to deal with the housing crisis in America for affordability, we're actually taking out of the current run rate, we're having a 50% decrease, which I think is wrong. And I'm sure you can't answer this question, but I do find it interesting that some people have already been able to go online and hear what the scuttle is from downtown lobbyists and then propose a chart. You don't have a chart. I guarantee if I ask you about this chart, you won't even be able to answer me because you'll say, I don't know because I don't know what this proposal is. But people are already taking the current assumptions that are circulating all over the internet today, and still hundreds of thousands of people of middle-class families in my state will pay higher taxes. That is not our idea of tax reform. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Cash, you recognize the question. Mr. Bartow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter from the Energy and Commerce Committee Democrats that advocates for broadening clean energy tax credits and opposes the raid on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Bartow, the current tax code provides some support to students and families to attend community college or obtain a higher education, try to make it more affordable. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's the Hope Credit. There's the Lifetime Learning
Well,
Credit.
for example, the American Opportunity
The American
tax
Opportunity
credit. What
Tax
is
Credit
that? What is
subsumed,
that?
The Hope Credit. It's partially refundable. It's a credit against tuition.
How much?
$2,500.
Okay, and that was eliminated in the Republican tax bill. Is that correct?
No, that's well, in the Senate bill, there's no change. And the House bill keeps the American Opportunity Tax Credit, eliminates the Lifetime Learning Credit.
And what is the
expands
lifetime learning credit? What is the lifetime learning credit?
A maximum credit of $2,000 based on expenses of up to $10,000.
So that's eliminated in the House bill.
It's eliminated.
And then the House Republican bill also repeals the very modest benefit for students and families that have student loan debt. Is that correct?
It repeals the deductibility of interest on student loan debt.
And the House Republican bill also, I don't know why someone thought this was wise to go and target our graduate students across the country, the folks who are teaching and doing research and really help to give America a competitive edge. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Colleagues, this is very unwise to undermine our own interests. You know, America's colleges and universities are the envy of the world, and we should be doing everything in our power to support them. So I'm going to offer a motion at this time that the conference not vote to approve the conference report until the JCT provides a certification that the cost of attending college or graduate school or the cost of obtaining a college degree or a graduate degree is not increased by reason of repeal or modification of education provisions in the tax code, including but not limited to repeal of the lifetime learning credit, reductions in the American Opportunity Tax Credit in any year it is available to a taxpayer, repeal of deductions for the interest paid on student loans and tuition fees, and repeal of the exclusions for tuition reductions related to employment at an institution of higher education, interest on United States savings bonds used to pay for tuition and employer-provided
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. The motion is not available. Senator Stabenow, you recognize the question. Mr. Bartow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Barthold, to you and your staff for all your hard work in the midst of a lot of complexity and confusion, I think. Is it accurate to say that under both the House and Senate bills, millions of working families with incomes under $200,000 a year would get a tax increase?
If I could just elaborate briefly, there's substantial changes as we described. There's
Right.
some case, depending upon the taxpayer's situation.
But bottom line,
there will be some. We've documented and we documented for you during the Finance Committee's deliberation that there will be fair number of cases where tax liabilities increase.
Thank you. In fact, according to your numbers that we have, JCT calculates that 32.48 million families with incomes under $200,000 end up with a tax increase under the House bill, and 37.79 million families with incomes under $200,000 end up with a tax increase under the Senate bill, according to your numbers. How many working families with incomes under $200,000 would receive a tax increase under either the House or Senate bill for 2019?
I'll have to get back. I'll have to get back to you on that,
Okay.
Senator Stepp.
Well, if I might, just according to the numbers that you have given us, it's 12.7 million households under the House bill and 12.93 million under the Senate bill by 2019.
I'll verify that.
and I
I'll have it sent to all the
appreciate
to all the conferees.
I appreciate that. Based on your analysis of the Senate bill, is it correct to say that 84.1% of Americans would see virtually no change in their tax liability or a tax increase of at least $100 in 2027?
The Senate bill?
Correct.
The Finance Committee bill
Yes,
in 2020.
2027.
2027, we estimated that slightly over 60% of all tax filing units would have a tax change of less than $100, either plus or minus.
Okay. I asked you this same question, the Senate committee and the markup, but I want to ask again here. The administration has promised that the average family will get at least a $4,000 annual raise if this legislation is enacted into law. Is there anything in the House or Senate bill that would end the corporate tax giveaways if this turns out not to be true?
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has
I would
expired.
appreciate
Senator
if
Portman,
that-
you're
Mr. Bartlett would just-
There was no trigger
Thank you.
provision in
So
the
there's nothing.
legislation.
Thank you.
Senator Portman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, my colleague and friend from Michigan was asking about the effects of the tax cuts for the middle class. So, Mr. Bartold, she asked about 2019. Let's go to your form. Let's go to your Joint Committee on Taxation distributional table that anybody can find on jct.gov. Give you a little advertisement there. Let's go to JCX-60-17, and that's for 2019, the same year that was just asked about. I'm looking at 10 different groups of taxpayers, cohorts of taxpayers, less than $10,000 all the way up to $1 million or over. So, for instance, $30,000 to $40,000, $75,000 to $100,000, and so on. I'm looking at this form, and I'm wondering how could what we just heard be true? Because this shows that there is tax relief in each of those groups, right?
That's correct, sir.
Every
There's
single one of these groups.
Aggregate tax reduction in every income category.
Yeah. So on average, in every single one of these groups, you're seeing tax relief, and it is, 9.7% decrease in taxes for folks making between 30 and 40,000. People between 100 and 200,000 at 6.8%. So it's tends to be a little higher number toward the lower brackets, but that's on your website. That's the information. So that means there is tax relief for these individuals who we represent. Is that correct?
In aggregate, yes, and on average, yes.
And for the majority of those people, correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Just wanted to clear that up. And then in terms of people who, because of the doubling the standard deduction, which is, as you say, it's like a zero tax bracket for up to $24,000 a family by doubling it, aren't there a lot of people that fall off the tax rolls altogether? There's people that aren't even going to have any tax liability who have it now. I sent you a letter on this, as you know, back in October, and you said that 3.1 million taxpayers would no longer have tax liability who have tax liability now. Think about that. This is 3 million Americans who are currently having to pay Uncle Sam and are working hard. Most of these people are folks who are working, who have tax liability despite the earning income tax credit and other things. Under this bill, they're not going to have any tax liability. That was based on a doubling
of the standard deduction, but it was only the child credit up to $1,500. So I would think with a child credit up to $2,000, which we have now, doubling the child tax credit, I would guess even more people are not going to have tax liability. Is that your sense?
That's correct, Senator Portman. Also, another factor there is when you and I spoke about this in October, you did not have a 10% bracket, which increases.
Okay, so more than 3 million people are not going to have any tax liability at all, Mr. Chairman. And I just think we need to stick to the facts here, and I would encourage folks to go see Tom's great website at jct.gov.
The gentleman's time in advertisement has expired. So, Senator Menendez, you're recognized.
The website crashed earlier today, Senator. I'm disappointed to
Mr.
report.
Barthel, can I reclaim, Mr. Chairman, can I reclaim my minutes here that I just
Yes,
lost in this
Senator, of
exchange?
course.
Thank you. So, Mr. Barthel, looking at your distributional chart, it's fair to say that people making $500,000 to $1 million, 91% would see greater than $500, correct?
In the Senate and the Finance reported bill for 2019, 500 million to 1,000, yes, 91%.
And $1 million and over, 80% would see greater than $500 tax decrease.
Decrease, that's
And
correct.
for those in the less than $10,000 category, 95.8% would see absolutely no tax change for them, or less than $100.
That's correct.
Now, let me ask you this with reference to your comparison of revenue provisions. On page 5, the reduction in the corporate tax rate to 20% in 2018 to 2017, you have it listed as $1,456 billion. Is that correct?
For the House,
Provisions,
and
yes.
the Senate had the delayed effective date.
Right. And the same provisions in the House on page 11, you have the net total cost as $1,445 billion. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator Menendez.
So basically, the net cost of the 1.4 plus trillion dollars that is lost is largely going to corporations. Now, let me ask you this. I heard about growth before, but I think it's a little disingenuous. As I understand it, JCTO basically said that the Senate bill increases growth by just 0.8 over 10 years. Is that correct?
That's not a growth rate that we reported, Senator Menendez.
Okay.
It's the average value of gross domestic product.
A gross domestic product. But still, that's 0.8 over 10 years.
It's the average outcome on an annual basis over those years. And again, it's the average, it's the level. It's a statement about the level, not about the growth rate.
Okay. So in essence, then I would have to divide that by 10 years, right?
Well, I tried to put it in dollar terms earlier by saying it's having a real, in terms of real dollars, since you expect some inflation over the period, benefit annually of about $140 billion.
Very quickly, does the House and Senate bills preserve the state and local deduction for corporations?
State and local taxes are deductible as business expenses for corporations, yes, sir.
Does it preserve the state and local tax deduction for individuals and families?
With respect to property taxes, not with respect to sales or income taxes.
And property taxes, it caps it, though. It doesn't preserve.
That's correct, sir. $10,000 cap in both the House.
So that's like giving up $30-something billion in a New Jersey case and being given a little amount back, and that's supposedly
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Shimkus, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, I'm an energy and commerce guy, so I tread carefully on taxes. But you've heard my opening statement where I talked about currently 80% of my individuals file and they don't itemize. So what is it about the doubling the personal exemption that then raises that amount projected to be 90%?
Well, actually, it's not the personal exemption; it's the standard.
Oh, the standard deduction. That's
deduction.
Right. I can't even say it right. So,
well, the standard deduction is essentially creating. People choose the standard deduction when it gives them a bigger reduction than their itemized deductions. So, right now, a married couple's standard deduction is a little over $12,000. If they had mortgage interest, charitable deductions, Illinois income tax, and that totaled to around $18,000, they would naturally choose to elect to itemize because 18,000 is a better deal to subtract from your income than the 12. If you double the standard deduction to 24,000, you wouldn't choose the 18.
So I think my colleagues, they underestimate the value of simplicity. You probably don't know this. Do you know how many people use an accountant to file their returns right now? Is there any estimation?
Actually, we do know the number of people that file electronically or with paid preparers. We have some estimates that I can provide that information to the Conferees.
Is there any other way other than the past writing that off as an expense that we know what is the kind of the average cost of hiring an accountant to file your taxes?
I have seen estimates of that. I don't have them available right now.
But if we move to a fair, flatter, simpler system, doubling the exemption, and less people have to go to an accountant, they would save that money from going to an accountant to file, would they not?
It's quite clear. I think that some people would choose to file themselves where they may pay to have someone file for them now.
And has there been any computation ever of the stress and strain of individuals throughout this country who file even using an accountant, but not knowing if they'll ever be called into a IRS tribunal with all their receipts to then get audited?
I'm not aware of any.
Is there a calculation of
of
lost time and wages when they have to take a day off of work to do that?
There are some studies that I can try and provide to you where people have tried to calculate the dollar value of time spent.
So this is a better system, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank you. I would like to thank. Mr. Carper, would like to be recognized? Question, Mr. Bartold?
If you have someone else to go ahead of me, that would be great.
I think you're the final question.
Oh, okay, good. Okay. I'd be happy to
Senator
yield.
Toomey, you recognize the question, Mr. Bartold.
I think Senator Toomey wanted to say nice things about me before
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to start by saying nice things about Senator Carper. Let the record show that I have a very high opinion and very high regard of Senator
I yield
Carper.
my time to Senator Toomey. So.
As long as I continue in this vein. And I enjoy the work that we do together on a variety of things and look forward to continuing to work with him. While I am in the mode of complimenting, I want to take a moment to just thank Tom Bartold and his team, because I know for a fact that they have been working incredible hours under a great deal of pressure, and they continue to be the consummate professionals, turning out first quality work under tremendous time constraints and very difficult circumstances. So I want to thank Tom and his team for that work. I have just really one short line of questioning, and that is, Ms. Bartle, the Senate bill, as you know, allows business to recognize the full cost of purchasing new equipment, vehicles, machinery, in the year in which they actually make the purchase, rather than amortize that cost over the useful life, which is a way that we've historically done this. That's correct, right?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And is it the view of joint tax that that has the effect of lowering the after-tax cost for a business to acquire that?
Yes, sir. That's a factor that reduces the cost of capital in an investment calculation.
And so all else being equal, if you lower the after-tax cost of purchasing new equipment, machinery, vehicles, business purchases more of it.
That's one of the factors that goes into the macro analysis that I described earlier for the members.
And when business purchase more of it, it is necessarily the case that someone had to work at producing that equipment, that machinery. There was a job. There are many jobs involved in the production, sale, distribution of that equipment. But then there are also jobs for the people who put that equipment to work. Is that right?
That's correct, sir. That's part of the employment effects that are picked up in the macroeconomic analysis.
So I mention this, Mr. Chairman, just because sometimes our colleagues who don't support this legislation suggest that there's not going to be any economic growth, there's not going to be any response. But in fact, as Mr. Bartold just confirmed, there is a very clear mechanism by which the policies in our legislation absolutely encourage more economic growth, more job creation, and as I said earlier, at a time when we are close to full employment, that can only lead to higher wages and bringing more people into workforce. This is exactly what our economy needs at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Carper, you recognize the question, Mr. Barthold.
I just want to start by saying just the nicest things I can about my friend from Pennsylvania. And I ask you to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
When we could do that. If I could, Mr. Bartol, again, our thanks to you and the folks you work with. We know you have a tough job. Thanks for doing it. Let me just ask, Tom, if I could, if the Senate passed Tax Cut and Jobs Act, Senate passed, were to become law, what do you think the increase in deficit would be resulting from that bill, according to JCT, please? It's a Senate passed bill.
The Senate passed bill, we have an estimate in JCX 63. So if you want to ask another question, I'll look it up while you ask your second question.
Okay. The second question I actually would relate to the first question. The question is whether or not I've seen estimates as cost of the in terms of extra deficit, extra debt, anywhere from 1.0 to 1.3 to 1.5 trillion dollars over the next 10 years. It's not clear to me whether the cost of interest on borrowing additional borrowing is included in that. And I think if it were, that it would push those estimates from 1.0 maybe to 1.6 trillion, from 1.3 to 1.9, 1.5 to 2.1.
Our estimate on the Senate passed bill, as reported in JCX 63, was that the conventional estimate was that the legislation over the 10-year budget period would lose $1,447 billion.
My follow-up question was on the interest.
That does not include any incremental increase in interest on federal debt that might be attributable to the higher debt load over that.
I've heard a number. It could be as much as $600 billion. Is that in the ballpark? Out of the ballpark?
I don't want to make a bad guess on that. I know that the Congressional Budget Office recently did some analysis of increased interest cost from higher deficit finance and various different options.
All right, thank you. Let me ask as a follow-up, Tom. If we take a look at the Senate bill, is it true that with a couple of exceptions, the provisions affecting individuals expire in generally by the end of 2025 in general?
The Senate legislation expires most all the individual provisions at the close of 2025.
Can you tell us just roughly what the 10-year cost of the bill would be if we assume those provisions affecting individuals are extended permanently? Any idea what that might be?
The cost within the budget period?
Yeah.
I'll have to respond to you separately. I don't have that available right now.
Okay. If I have time
Senator, time has expired. The 3 minutes goes quickly.
No, thank you. Thanks.
So look, I would like to also thank Tom, you and all the professional team at Joint Committee on Taxation for doing a really remarkable job for months and months of months. So thank you. I'd like to thank all the members of the conference for your attendance today, your thoughtful insights. American people have waited decades for tax reform, and right now we're in the home stretch, closer than ever to getting across the finish line. Tax reform that provides more jobs, fair taxes, and bigger paychecks for hardworking families across this country. With that, the Conference Committee on H.R. 1 is adjourned.